500 million years ago, Earth was a silent theatre waiting for its performers. The ocean stretched wide and barren of complexity, home mostly to simple forms of life that clung to existence in obscurity. For billions of years, biology had moved at a whisper, cells gathering into colonies, filaments, and fragile mats that painted shorelines in muted colours. But then, as if a curtain had been drawn back, the world erupted in a spectacle never before seen. In a geologic instant, an explosion of diversity unfolded, a surge of shapes, structures, and strategies that would forever redefine what life could be. This was the Cambrian Explosion, an event so abrupt in evolutionary terms that it has puzzled and fascinated scientists for centuries. Fossils embedded in ancient shale reveal creatures both alien and familiar. Segmented trilobites with crystalline eyes, soft-bodied predators with grasping limbs, and the first vertebrate-like forms that hint at a distant ancestry to humankind. The seas turned into experimental arenas where adaptation meant survival and innovation carved the blueprint for future ecosystems. It was not a single spark, but a cascade of triggers, changes in oxygen, in climate, in the chemistry of the seas, that together forged a revolution in life. This is not merely a story of creatures long buried in stone, but of the forces that shaped every living thing that followed. To understand the Cambrian is to glimpse the moment when Earth first learned to dream in forms. Welcome to Arcane Skies. If this journey stirs your imagination, like and subscribe, and share in the comments where and when you are watching this story unfold. The story of the Cambrian Explosion does not begin with the sudden appearance of fantastical creatures, but with the long silence before the storm. For nearly 3 billion years after life first appeared on Earth, existence moved at a slow and steady pace. The earliest organisms were microscopic, single-celled beings drifting in shallow seas, gathering sunlight or chemical energy in their fragile walls. Cyanobacteria, ancient architects of the atmosphere, released oxygen into the air, slowly transforming the planet's chemistry. Layer upon layer of their activity can still be seen in stromatolites, dome-like fossil structures that rise from ancient shorelines like frozen waves. These microbial colonies dominated Earth for ages, holding a monopoly on life with little competition until subtle shifts began to reshape the balance. By the time we approached the dawn of the Cambrian, Earth itself had endured a restless history. Continental plates drifted, collided and fractured, creating shallow seas rich with nutrients. Volcanoes poured minerals into the water, while glaciers from earlier ice ages melted, flooding basins with fresh opportunities. Oxygen levels had risen compared to the barren past, though not evenly across the globe. This invisible gas, essential for fueling complex bodies, began to accumulate enough to allow larger organisms to breathe and move with new vigour. The stage was being set, though no witness at the time could recognise the immensity of what was about to unfold. The Ediacaran period, just before the Cambrian, offered the first glimpse of life experimenting with larger and more intricate forms. Fossils from this time resemble quilted impressions pressed into stone, soft-bodied organisms without hard skeletons, lying flat against the sea floor. Some look like fronds, others like discs or rippling mats, drifting passively in the currents. They were strange and enigmatic, unlike anything alive today, and for decades paleontologists debated whether they were truly animals or a separate branch of life altogether. What is certain is that these beings were fragile, their bodies leaving behind ghostly silhouettes but little else. They lacked eyes, jaws, or bones. Their survival depended on stillness and simplicity. Yet, in their shadows, something more daring was taking shape. When the Cambrian dawned, life did not merely change, it reinvented itself. Animals began to evolve skeletons, shells, and teeth, innovations that transformed survival strategies. To resist predation, some species grew protective armour. To hunt, others developed claws and grasping limbs. predators and prey became locked in an evolutionary race, each adapting to the other's advances. This arms race, in turn, fueled rapid diversification as every innovation opened new ecological niches. The Cambrian seas became arenas of invention, filled with organisms testing shapes and strategies never before imagined. Here was the birth of complexity not through slow drift, but through leaps and collisions of possibility. But what sparked this sudden revolution after eons of quiet? One hypothesis lies in the chemistry of the oceans. As tectonic activity broke apart continents, erosion washed minerals like calcium and phosphate into the sea. These building blocks allowed animals to construct shells and skeletons, tools for defense and structure. Another theory focuses on oxygen. Its rising availability may have unlocked the energy required for larger bodies and active movement. Genetic evidence adds yet another layer. Around this time, animals appear to have developed new sets of developmental genes, particularly the so-called Hox genes, which regulate body plans. With these genetic instructions, creatures could experiment with entirely new anatomies, segmentation, limbs, sensory organs, blueprints that would echo through millions of years to come. The Cambrian Explosion was not a singular flash, but a cascade of events. Picture ancient seas teeming with trilobites, their jointed exoskeletons reflecting early morning light as they scuttled across the seabed. Nearby, worms wriggled through the sediment, stirring nutrients into circulation. Above them, jellyfish-like forms drifted in the currents, while predators with armoured jaws lurked in ambush. Each niche in the ecosystem demanded adaptation, and each adaptation triggered another in response. It was as if life had suddenly discovered the full range of possibilities hidden within its own code. Among the most haunting fossils from this era are those of the Burgess Shale in Canada, a treasure trove of Cambrian creatures preserved in exquisite detail. Here we see Anomalocaris, a predator larger than most of its contemporaries, with grasping appendages and a circular mouth lined with teeth like a crown of thorns. Its body was built for speed, its eyes composed of thousands of lenses capable of detecting the faintest movement. Against it swam small armoured animals, some rolling into defensive balls, others burrowing into the sediment to escape detection. Such interactions were not isolated. They were constant, creating webs of survival and extinction that reshaped the oceans each generation. The Cambrian world was not a peaceful garden, but a restless experiment, where invention carried both promise and peril. Yet for all the violence and hunger, there was also beauty in this diversity. Creatures began to sense the world in ways no being had before. The first compound eyes mirrored sunlight, the first nervous systems coordinated swift movements, and the first circulatory systems pumped life through vessels. Every innovation was a threshold crossed, a door opened to possibilities beyond the imagination of earlier life. The Cambrian seas were not merely filled with creatures, they were filled with awareness, however primitive, and with the beginnings of interaction that hinted at futures beyond survival. Still, many mysteries remain. Why did the Ediacaran organisms vanish so completely, leaving only traces of their soft forms? Were they outcompeted by the new Cambrian animals, or did they simply represent experiments that reached their limits? Why did complexity erupt in this moment and not earlier, when conditions might also have allowed it? The answers remain scattered among fossils, geochemical signatures, and the DNA of modern descendants. Each clue adds to the mosaic, but the full picture continues to elude certainty. What we do know is that from this point forward, the Earth would never again be the same. Life had broken free from simplicity, and the momentum of diversity had begun. As we peer into this strange past, the Cambrian seas stretch before us like alien landscapes hidden beneath waves. They whisper of struggles we cannot hear, and of victories etched only in stone. And yet, to step further into this unfolding story is to realize that the Cambrian was not a sudden miracle, but the next act in a much older drama, one written long before skeletons and shells first gleamed beneath the tides. What forces, buried in time, were already stirring before the explosion began? Long before shells and spines carved their marks into the Cambrian seas, the Earth itself was a restless planet, sculpting the foundations upon which this new diversity would bloom. The continents of that ancient age were not arranged as they are today, but clustered in strange configurations, smaller land masses drifting across a vast super-ocean. Rivers carried eroded minerals into shallow coastal shelves, transforming them into fertile nurseries for evolving life. These marginal seas, neither deep abyss nor open ocean, offered the perfect stage, oxygen-rich shallows with steady sunlight and nutrients stirred by tides. In these liminal spaces, biology found room to experiment. Each ripple of current carried not just sediment, but the possibility of transformation. The chemistry of these oceans was in flux. Evidence from isotopes embedded in Cambrian rocks reveals that levels of calcium, phosphate and trace metals surged compared to earlier times. For early animals, these elements were both challenge and opportunity. Calcium carbonate could poison soft tissues if left unchecked, yet it also offered the raw material for protective shells and exoskeletons. Phosphate, essential for energy transfer within cells, gave organisms new metabolic power. The very chemistry that once threatened fragile life now became a canvas upon which evolution painted new designs. This shift, gradual on the scale of human perception but abrupt in geologic terms, was one of the invisible engines behind the Cambrian transformation. Yet ocean chemistry alone does not explain the cascade. Oxygen, that elusive breath of life, surged in ways that tipped the balance. Earlier eras had seen only meagre traces in the atmosphere, enough for microbes but insufficient for complex bodies requiring fuel for muscle, nerve, and circulation. By the dawn of the Cambrian, oxygen levels appear to have climbed significantly, though unevenly across different regions. In oxygen-rich pockets, animals grew larger, moved faster, and pushed the boundaries of anatomy. Those trapped in oxygen-poor waters remained simple, relegated to survival rather than expansion. This patchwork environment became a crucible of selection, rewarding innovation and punishing stagnation. Where oxygen lingered, new ecosystems took root, fragile yet daring. Beneath this biological drama, Earth's geology hummed with its own rhythm. Volcanic eruptions spewed minerals into the seas, while tectonic shifts reshaped coastlines and carved new basins. These movements stirred nutrients like a giant planetary cauldron, ensuring no stability could last too long. The Cambrian seas were not serene aquariums, but restless environments where the ground itself betrayed its inhabitants. Yet within this instability lay opportunity. Changing habitats forced life to adapt, and adaptation bred diversity. Every earthquake, every landslide, every plume of volcanic ash etched another challenge into the record of survival, and for those that endured, evolution responded with new solutions. Harder shells, faster movements, sharper senses. Amid these shifting conditions, a genetic revolution was also unfolding. Deep within the cells of early animals, molecular blueprints known as Hox genes orchestrated the layout of bodies. These genes did not create new organs directly, but rather determined where and when certain structures would appear. Like conductors guiding an orchestra, they allowed segments, limbs, and sensory organs to arise in different combinations. With this toolkit, evolution could rearrange the architecture of life with unprecedented freedom. A slight change in timing might elongate a limb. A shift in expression could generate a new body segment. Suddenly, variation was not just a matter of chance, but a vast field of possibilities waiting to be explored. The result was a kaleidoscope of forms, some successful, many doomed, all part of the grand experiment of the Cambrian. To imagine these early seas is to enter a world both alien and familiar. Picture trilobites scuttling across sandy floors, their compound eyes catching glimmers of light as predators drifted overhead. Their armour was segmented, allowing them to curl into protective balls like living fossils of defence. Nearby, worm-like creatures tunnelled through the sediment, aerating the seabed and creating hidden passageways. Jellyfish-like medusoids floated gently, their pulsations stirring currents that carried microscopic prey. And above them all swam Anomalocaris, a hunter with grasping appendages, enormous compound eyes, and a circular mouth armed with plates of teeth. To encounter it was to face a new reality. Life had discovered predation not as an accident, but as a strategy. The introduction of predation cannot be overstated. For the first time, survival required more than growth. It demanded escape, defence, and awareness. Armour hardened, spines bristled, eyes sharpened, and nervous systems grew more complex. In this evolutionary arms race, each advanced by predators forced countermeasures by prey. Some burrowed deeper into the sand while others thickened their shells. Some developed speed while others relied on camouflage. The Cambrian Explosion was not just about diversity and form, but about the dynamic interplay of offence and defence, innovation and response. This perpetual contest etched itself into the fossil record, creating a mosaic of interactions that still echoes in modern ecosystems. Yet the Cambrian was not merely a battlefield. It was also a garden of new ecological roles. Grazers fed on microbial mats, shredding ancient cyanobacterial colonies that had once coated the seafloor undisturbed. Scavengers cleaned the remains of the fallen, recycling nutrients into the ecosystem. Filter feeders drew sustenance from clouds of plankton, while deposit feeders ingested sediment itself, extracting what little nourishment it contained. With every new role, the web of life grew more intricate, binding species together in networks of dependency. No longer were organisms living in isolation. Each existence was tied to countless others, weaving a tapestry that defined survival itself. This interconnection was perhaps the most radical innovation of all, for it ensured that life was no longer just a collection of individuals, but a community. But what of those that did not survive the transition? The fossil record tells us that the Cambrian was as much about extinction as invention. Countless experimental body plans disappeared without descendants. Evolutionary dead ends preserved only as impressions in stone. Some looked like flattened discs with radial patterns, others like ribbed tubes or branching fronds. They remind us that the explosion was not a steady march toward perfection, but a chaotic branching where most paths led nowhere. Evolution was not gentle or purposeful, it was relentless, discarding failures as quickly as it celebrated success. The creatures that remained were those best suited to the shifting theatre of the Cambrian seas, and through them the lineage of modern life was secured. Even now, the Cambrian raises questions that refuse easy answers. Did rising oxygen truly provide the spark, or was it merely one factor among many? Were genetic innovations the true trigger, or were they only unleashed because the environment demanded them? Was it the chemistry of the seas, the instability of the continents, or the escalating arms race between predator and prey? Perhaps it was all of these, colliding in a perfect storm of opportunity and pressure. What is certain is that the Cambrian Explosion was no single event, but a convergence, an orchestra of forces that together transformed the world. And so the curtain of time draws us deeper into this strange ocean, where the sediments conceal both triumph and tragedy. For while the Cambrian marked the birth of complexity, it also set into motion forces that would shape the destiny of life for eons. To step further into these waters is to discover that the explosion of diversity was only the beginning of a longer story, one that stretches beyond the sea and into the very blueprint of our existence. What whispers still lie buried in these ancient rocks, waiting to reveal the secrets of the next great leap? The Cambrian seas, restless and overflowing with invention, were not merely arenas of survival, but living laboratories where bodies became canvases for experimentation. Here, in the shifting currents, and on the shadowed sea floors, evolution played with symmetry, segmentation, and sensation, crafting organisms that seemed almost dreamlike in their variety. What unites these creatures is not their familiarity to us, but their sheer strangeness. For the Cambrian was a time when life was unafraid to try every possible form, no matter how fleeting. And within this chaos, the earliest blueprints of modern animal groups quietly emerged. Among the most iconic denizens of this age were the trilobites, whose fossilized remains are scattered across the world like fragments of an ancient mosaic. With their jointed exoskeletons and ridged segments, they scuttled across sandy sea floors, their multifaceted eyes scanning for danger or opportunity. Those compound eyes, each composed of hundreds of tiny lenses, represent one of the first sophisticated visual systems in the history of life. Sight itself became an evolutionary weapon, allowing predators to hunt with precision and prey to detect danger before it struck. Trilobites embody the Cambrian spirit of innovation, not only survivors of their age, but architects of sensory awareness that would ripple through evolution. Yet not all Cambrian creatures were armoured or recognisable. Many were soft-bodied, their forms preserved in rare deposits like the Burgess Shale or Chengjiang in China, where sudden mudslides entombed entire ecosystems in fine sediment. These fossils reveal beings so unusual that early paleontologists struggled to classify them. Hallucigenia, for instance, is a spiny, worm-like creature whose fossils were once reconstructed upside down, its protective spines mistaken for legs. Opabenia, with its 5 eyes perched atop a soft body and a flexible proboscis ending in a claw, seemed more like a surreal painting than an animal. These strange experiments remind us that evolution is not a straight line but a branching tree, with countless twigs cut short by extinction. The Burgess Shale in particular serves as a time capsule of strangeness. Preserved in exquisite detail are animals that might appear alien even to our imagination. Predators with gaping mouths lined in rings of teeth, filter feeders shaped like delicate fans, and shrimp-like swimmers armed with grasping limbs. What these fossils teach us is not just who lived during the Cambrian, but how diverse the pathways of life truly were. Many of these creatures left no descendants, their lineages vanishing into silence, yet their existence speaks of an age when possibility itself was boundless. Every fossil from these beds whispers a single truth. The rules of biology were still being written. As extraordinary as these forms appear, they also reveal the roots of modern phyla, broad categories of life that still structure the animal kingdom today. Within the Cambrian seas, we see the ancestors of arthropods, the group that now includes insects, spiders, and crustaceans. We see early forms of chordates, a lineage that would eventually give rise to fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals. We glimpse mollusks with primitive shells, ancestors to clams and octopuses, and the first echinoderms, kin to today's starfish and sea urchins. Though alien in detail, these creatures signal the deep continuity of life. What we know today as familiar, wings, bones, shells, nerves, first took shape in this crucible of experimentation. But survival in the Cambrian was no guarantee. Each innovation sparked a chain of consequences that forced other organisms to adapt. The evolution of jaws or grasping appendages meant that hiding places became more valuable. The emergence of burrowing creatures reshaped the seabed, disrupting microbial mats that had blanketed ocean floors for eons. Predators forced prey underground, and in turn, prey reshaped the very architecture of marine ecosystems. The seabed became riddled with tunnels and burrows, evidence of creatures digging to survive. This activity, known as bioturbation, transformed ocean sediments, changing the flow of nutrients and oxygen within them. Life was not only diversifying above the seafloor, it was literally rewriting the earth beneath it. The Cambrian was, in many ways, a world of thresholds. The invention of skeletons marked one such crossing, but so too did the invention of movement itself. Muscles coordinated by primitive nervous systems allowed creatures to dart, burrow, swim, and seize. These motions were slow compared to modern standards, but to the creatures of the time, they represented an entirely new dimension of survival. Movement was energy, awareness, and power. With it came the potential for migration, for ecosystems to spill across seas and continents. Once unleashed, the ability to move reshaped not only individuals but the balance of entire ecosystems. And still, the Cambrian seas held mysteries that confound scientists even today. Why, for example, do so many Cambrian creatures appear so radically unlike anything that followed? Was evolution in this period driven by sheer novelty, only later constrained into more conservative forms? Or do the bizarre fossils of Opabinia and Hallucigenia represent roads not taken, experiments that were viable for a time but unsustainable in the long march of history? To walk among these creatures in imagination is to feel both wonder and unease, as if stepping into a world that teetered between possibility and impossibility, creation and collapse. The Cambrian Explosion challenges us to rethink the very nature of progress in evolution. It was not a story of inevitable improvement, but of relentless trial and error. Countless lineages flourished briefly only to vanish, their unique anatomies never repeated. Others endured, carrying forward designs so effective that they remain with us still. The trilobite's compound eye finds echoes in the vision of insects today. The segmented body of arthropods became the blueprint for one of Earth's most successful groups of animals. The notochord, a flexible rod that appeared in primitive chordates, was the distant seed of the vertebrate spine. These echoes remind us that we too are children of the Cambrian, our bodies carrying the legacy of that long-ago experiment. And yet, even as we trace these connections, the Cambrian remains elusive. Fossil beds capture only fragments of the whole, moments frozen by chance catastrophe. Entire ecosystems vanished without leaving a record, their participants known only by inference. The ocean itself has erased much of its past, grinding shells to dust and burying evidence beneath uncounted layers. To study the Cambrian is to peer through fogged glass, where the outlines are clear but the details blur. Still, the fragments we do possess burn with a kind of intensity, like sparks scattered across dark stone. Each spark is a glimpse of the unimaginable vitality that surged through those waters. Perhaps the most haunting thought of all is that what we know as the Cambrian Explosion was, to its participants, no explosion at all. For them it was simply life unfolding, one generation at a time, blind to the grand patterns we now reconstruct. To a trilobite there was no awareness of novelty, only the urgency of feeding and avoiding predation. To an anomalocaris there was no sense of innovation, only the pursuit of prey in shadowed waters. The explosion exists only in hindsight, a pattern woven from fossils and rocks, revealed across hundreds of millions of years. To them, it was not an age of wonder, but of survival. And so we descend further into this alien ocean, where strangeness was the rule rather than the exception. For while the Cambrian gave rise to the ancestors of all modern animals, it also filled the seas with creatures that defy our categories and stretch our imagination. If these bizarre forms remind us of anything, it is that the possibilities of life are far greater than the narrow slice we know today. What other experiments hidden in the darkness of time may still lie undiscovered beneath the ancient seabeds, waiting to tell their stories? Beneath the weight of geological time, the Cambrian seas shimmered with potential, but they were also arenas of escalating tension. For while diversity flourished, no creature existed in isolation. Each adaptation by one species rippled outward, altering the chances of survival for countless others. The Cambrian Explosion was not simply about the invention of body plans. It was about the invention of ecological relationships, predation, competition, cooperation, that transformed life from scattered individuals into interconnected networks. To walk through this ancient world in imagination is to witness the very birth of ecosystems as we know them. At the heart of this transformation lay the predator-prey dynamic, a force that reshaped evolution in profound ways. Before the Cambrian, most organisms were passive, feeding on microbes, absorbing nutrients from the water, or grazing on mats of cyanobacteria. But with the emergence of predators like Anomalocaris, life could no longer afford passivity. Prey were compelled to evolve defences, thicker shells, spiny exoskeletons, the ability to burrow into the sediment. Some even developed false patterns of camouflage, blending into the seabed or mimicking the textures of microbial mats. In turn, predators became faster, sharper, more cunning. This dance of survival, brutal yet creative, drove complexity forward at a relentless pace. The Cambrian seas, for all their strangeness, were already ruled by the same pressures that govern ecosystems today. One of the most striking consequences of this new dynamic was the rise of vision. Eyes had existed in rudimentary forms earlier, but in the Cambrian they became widespread and sophisticated. Trilobites, with their crystalline compound eyes, could detect light, movement, and shapes with surprising clarity. Predators with advanced vision gained the ability to stalk prey more effectively, while prey with vision could anticipate threats before they arrived. This sensory arms race created a new dimension of interaction. No longer was survival determined solely by physical structures like shells or spines, but also by awareness, by the ability to perceive the world and act upon that perception. In this sense, the Cambrian was not just the birth of new bodies, it was the dawn of consciousness in its earliest form. Alongside the evolution of sight came the refinement of movement. Muscles became stronger, nervous systems more efficient, body plans more specialized. Arthropods scuttled across the seabed with articulated legs, while worms burrowed deeper, their undulations stirring the sediment. Some animals swam freely in the open water, exploring vertical space in ways that earlier life had never attempted. The oceans, once dominated by static mats of microbes, now teemed with motion, pursuit, escape, exploration. This dynamism redefined the seafloor itself. Where once carpets of cyanobacteria spread undisturbed, burrowers broke apart these ancient ecosystems, oxygenating sediments and reshaping the chemical balance. It was not only that animals were evolving to survive in their world, they were remaking the world itself. Yet, even as predation and defense fueled innovation, cooperation and complexity quietly unfolded in parallel. Filter feeders strained plankton from the water, recycling energy into food webs that supported larger predators. Scavengers cleared away carcasses, ensuring nutrients were returned to circulation. Each new role added another thread to the intricate tapestry of life. For the first time, ecosystems began to resemble the interconnected webs we see today, where the fate of one species is bound to countless others. The Cambrian Explosion was not only about diversity in form, but about diversity in function, a proliferation of ecological strategies that allowed life to flourish in more complex and resilient ways. Fossil beds from this time reveal not only individual creatures but entire communities frozen in stone. In some deposits, clusters of trilobites lie preserved together, perhaps evidence of social behaviour or mass mortality during storms. Other fossils show predator and prey captured in their final struggle, jaws locked around armoured bodies. These glimpses remind us that the Cambrian seas were not abstract theatres, but living systems, filled with interactions as rich and unpredictable as any modern reef. The fossils do not speak, but they suggest stories of hunger and escape, of reproduction and death, of countless small dramas that together shape the course of evolution. But why here, and why then? Why did life's great diversification not occur earlier, when oxygen levels first began to rise or when genetic toolkits like Hox genes first appeared? Some researchers argue that it was the convergence of multiple forces, geological, chemical and biological, that created the perfect storm. Rising oxygen enabled larger bodies. Shifting ocean chemistry provided minerals for skeletons. Tectonic activity created new shallow seas rich in nutrients. Predation triggered the arms race of innovation. None of these factors alone would have sufficed, but together they unleashed a cascade that could not be stopped. The Cambrian Explosion, in this view, was less a sudden spark and more the tipping point of a long accumulating chain of causes. Yet even with these explanations, mystery lingers. The fossil record shows that many Cambrian creatures were evolutionary experiments that left no descendants. Their anatomies were wild, their strategies peculiar, their legacies short-lived. Why did some succeed while others vanished? Was survival simply a matter of chance, being in the right place at the right time, or were certain body plans inherently more adaptable? These questions remind us that evolution is not a story of progress toward perfection, but of contingency and survival. The winners of the Cambrian were not necessarily the most complex or the most innovative, but those that best fit the shifting conditions of their environment. For all its strangeness, the Cambrian world was not without beauty. Imagine a shallow sea illuminated by shafts of sunlight, trilobites glittering like jeweled beetles as they marched across rippled sand. Above them, translucent swimmers drifted like fragments of glass, their bodies catching the light in fleeting flashes. At the edges of reefs, worm-like creatures probed the sediment, leaving delicate trails that told of hidden lives below. Even the predators, fierce and alien, moved with a grace born of necessity, their movements sculpted by eons of selective pressure. In this world, every motion was survival, but also expression, a silent choreography written in water and light. The Cambrian Explosion forces us to confront the nature of beginnings. We often imagine life's history as a steady climb, from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. But the Cambrian tells a different story, one of sudden branching, of chaos and creativity bursting forth in unpredictable directions. It reminds us that complexity does not emerge gradually in neat steps, but in waves of experimentation, many of which fail before a few endure. To study the Cambrian is to glimpse the contingency of our own existence, for without those ancient innovations, eyes, skeletons, nervous systems, we would not be here at all. And so the journey through these ancient seas continues, deeper into the mysteries of evolution's great leap. For the Cambrian was not merely an explosion of bodies, but the awakening of systems, relationships, and possibilities. Each fossil, each trace, carries a whisper of that awakening, urging us to look closer, to imagine further. And as the currents of time carry us onward, the question lingers like a tide. What other secrets lie buried in the ancient mud, waiting to reveal the hidden rhythms that shape the earliest symphony of life? In the ancient seas of the Cambrian, every ripple of water concealed both opportunity and peril. For creatures that had only recently discovered eyes, muscles, and skeletons, survival meant navigating a world filled with innovation, where the rules of existence were being rewritten with each generation. Yet this was not simply a stage for individual struggle. It was the birthplace of ecological complexity, where life began weaving itself into webs that bound every organism together. What had once been a planet of microbial carpets now pulsed with systems of interaction, as fragile as they were revolutionary. One of the most profound shifts was the emergence of ecological niches, distinct roles within the environment that different organisms came to occupy. Before, life was largely uniform, with simple feeders scraping microbial mats or drifting in currents. But as predators prowled, scavengers followed. As filter feeders drew sustenance from plankton, grazers consumed algae and burrowers reshaped sediments. Each adaptation carved out a space, and each space created new opportunities for others. For the first time in Earth's history, ecosystems became layered, intricate, and dynamic. The Cambrian Explosion was not just the proliferation of bodies, it was the invention of communities. Among the creatures that thrived in these communities were the trilobites, whose segmented armour allowed them both protection and mobility. Their fossils, scattered across continents, speak of extraordinary abundance and diversity. Some trilobites were small as grains of rice, while others grew to the length of a human forearm. They scuttled along the seabed in herds, perhaps migrating together, their compound eyes glittering like mosaics. They were grazers, scavengers, and survivors, feeding at the base of food webs and, in turn, serving as prey for larger hunters. To imagine them is to see the Cambrian floor alive with movement, a ceaseless ballet of armoured forms etching trails across the sand. Above them, more sinister shapes glided through the water. Anomalocaris, the great hunter of its age, stretched more than 2 feet long, a giant in a world of small creatures. Its grasping appendages snatched prey, dragging them toward its circular mouth armed with serrated plates. Its large compound eyes, among the most advanced of their time, made it a formidable predator, able to detect the faintest shift in the currents. Fossils show trilobites scarred by bite marks, evidence of desperate escapes from its jaws. And yet, for all its ferocity, Anomalocaris too was subject to the limits of its world. When prey hid in burrows or armoured themselves beyond its reach, its dominance faltered. Even the apex predator was bound by the ebb and flow of evolution. In these seas, size and strength were not the only routes to success. Many Cambrian creatures survived through subtlety, camouflage, stealth, or speed. Some wore elaborate spines and plates to deter attackers. Others evolved flexible bodies that could slip into crevices where predators could not follow. Still others took refuge beneath the sediment, their trails and burrows crisscrossing the seabed like an unseen network of tunnels. These strategies remind us that survival was not always about confrontation. Sometimes it was about vanishing, blending, or enduring quietly in the shadows. In the Cambrian, as in all ages, innovation was not limited to the loud and the obvious. One of the most remarkable aspects of this time was the role of burrowing animals. Their digging reshaped the seafloor, oxygenating sediments and disrupting the thick microbial mats that had once dominated. This activity, known as bioturbation, transformed the ocean floor into something entirely new, a dynamic, ever-changing environment rather than a static carpet of microbes. In doing so, burrowers opened new opportunities for other organisms, creating fresh habitats and recycling nutrients. The Cambrian Explosion was as much about reshaping landscapes as it was about reshaping bodies. Life was beginning to alter the very world in which it lived, a pattern that would echo across deep time until the present day. Fossil beds reveal astonishing snapshots of these moments. In the Burgess Shale, creatures with delicate bodies, rarely preserved elsewhere, lie frozen in exquisite detail. Opabinia, with its 5 stalked eyes and trunk-like appendage, seems like something conjured from a fever dream, yet it was perfectly adapted to probing sediments for hidden prey. Hallucigenia, once reconstructed upside down, reveals rows of spines along its back, a living thorn defending itself against predators. Morella, a small arthropod, displays feathery limbs that likely filtered food from the water, while Wawaxia bristled with armoured scales and protective spines. These creatures may appear bizarre to us, but in their time, each embodied a solution to the problems of survival, a different answer to the same ancient questions of how to feed, move, and endure. The Cambrian world was one of constant feedback. Predation encouraged armour demanded stronger jaws, burrowing disrupted microbial mats, which in turn forced grazers to adapt to new feeding strategies. These cycles created what scientists call ecological escalation, a process where innovation in one group drives counter-innovation in another. The seas became not just populated but dynamic, pulsing with the energy of perpetual adaptation. This escalation, relentless and unending, is why the Cambrian Explosion left such an indelible mark. It was evolution in dialogue with itself, every change answered by another. And yet, for all the survival and struggle, reproduction remained the silent heartbeat of this world. Every adaptation had meaning only if it could be passed on to the next generation. Fossil evidence suggests that many Cambrian creatures produced vast numbers of eggs, releasing them into the currents to drift as plankton, before settling into their adult forms. This reproductive strategy ensured survival not through the protection of the few, but through the abundance of the many. Life flooded the seas with offspring, gambling that some would endure. In this way, survival was not just about innovation in body design, but about sheer persistence, about overwhelming the odds with numbers. Still, many lineages vanished despite their abundance. The fossil record tells us that the Cambrian was filled with evolutionary dead ends, creatures whose bizarre anatomies and strategies failed to outlast the pressures of their environment. They are preserved in stone as reminders that evolution is not progress, but experiment, an endless series of trials, most of which end in silence. But even these failures played a role, for each extinction opened space for others, each disappearance reshaping the balance of ecosystems. The Cambrian seas were as much graves as they were cradles. To gaze upon this world is to realize that its beauty lay in its strangeness. Imagine sunlight filtering through shallow waters, illuminating forests of sponge-like organisms anchored to the seabed. Picture clouds of plankton drifting, trilobites swarming like living jewels, predators gliding through the shadows. It was a world of contrasts, fragile yet fierce, alien yet foundational, chaotic yet patterned. The Cambrian Explosion was not simply an episode in the past. It was the opening act of the story of animals, the moment when complexity itself surged into being. But the story does not end here, for even as life filled the seas with diversity, questions remain. What forces limited this surge? Why did certain groups thrive while others vanished? And how did this restless experiment pave the way for the great ecosystems that would follow in the Ordovician seas? To look deeper into the Cambrian is to feel the pull of those mysteries, drawing us toward the next chapter in life's unfolding epic. The Cambrian world was more than a theatre of survival. It was a crucible of transformation where landscapes, climates, and currents conspired with evolution to shape the fate of countless lineages. To understand why life erupted in such extraordinary variety, one must look not only at the creatures themselves, but at the planet that hosted them. Earth in the Cambrian was in motion, oceans shifting, continents wandering, climates fluctuating. The environment itself was an active participant in the explosion of life, forcing adaptation, rewarding innovation, and erasing the fragile with ruthless indifference. Continents at the time were fragmented into smaller land masses, adrift in an immense superocean called Panthalassa. These wandering blocks of land created broad, shallow seas along their margins, areas bathed in sunlight and rich with nutrients washed in from erosion. Such shallow environments were the perfect nurseries for biodiversity, providing energy from the sun, oxygen from the atmosphere, and a constant supply of minerals carried down by rivers. Unlike the deep ocean, where resources are scarce, these continental shelves offered abundance. It was here, in the golden light filtering through shallow waters, that ecosystems flourished. The seafloor became a mosaic of habitats, reefs, burrows, microbial mats, sandy plains, all supporting an ever-expanding cast of organisms. The climate too played its part. The Cambrian period followed a series of dramatic ice ages, and as glaciers melted, sea levels rose, flooding coastal regions. Warmer oceans circulated differently, carrying nutrients into places where life could seize them. Fossil evidence suggests that ocean chemistry oscillated between states, with pulses of oxygenation alternating with episodes of depletion. These fluctuations acted as selective filters, pushing organisms to adapt to instability. Those that could survive change thrived. Those that could not disappeared. Life was not only learning how to endure, but how to persist through cycles of abundance and scarcity, stability and upheaval. The oxygenation of the oceans, uneven though it was, opened pathways for complexity. Oxygen fuels metabolism, and higher concentrations allowed animals to grow larger and move faster. But this came at a cost. Larger bodies required more energy, and with energy came vulnerability. Creatures had to feed more efficiently, which spurred the invention of jaws, appendages, and digestive systems capable of breaking down complex food. These changes reinforced the predator-prey arms race, weaving metabolism itself into the spiral of escalation. Energy, once the quiet currency of microbes, now became the engine of conflict and invention. Minerals played a role just as critical. As continents weathered under shifting climates, rivers carried calcium and phosphate into the seas. These elements, once toxic in excess, became the scaffolding for skeletons and shells. Organisms that learned to harness them gained armor against attack and structure for movement. From these innovations came trilobites with articulated exoskeletons, mollusks with coiled shells, and early echinoderms with calcified plates. The ocean floor glittered with the remnants of these structures, a record of both survival and loss. Every discarded shell, every broken carapace was evidence of the new material world being forged by biology. The geological stage was dynamic, and with it came continual disruption. Tectonic shifts created new shorelines, while volcanic eruptions blanketed seas with ash, altering chemistry and challenging ecosystems. Each disturbance acted like a test, erasing the fragile and rewarding resilience. Evolution thrives on such tests. Without disruption, innovation stagnates. The Cambrian Explosion, then, was not a singular miracle, but the cumulative effect of countless stresses, each forcing life to adapt in ways that expanded the possibilities of form and function. In these restless environments, symbiosis and cooperation began to emerge alongside competition. Fossils hint at early reef-like communities where sponges and other filter feeders anchored themselves, creating habitats for smaller creatures. These primitive reefs, though not yet the coral structures we know today, represented the first attempts at ecosystem engineering, life-shaping space for life. Such interactions laid the groundwork for future complexity, where organisms would not only adapt to environments but create them. Already, the Cambrian hinted at the reciprocity between life and Earth that would come to define the planet's history. But the Cambrian seas were also perilous in ways we struggle to imagine. Episodes of low oxygen, or anoxia, swept through certain basins, suffocating entire ecosystems. Evidence of black shales, organic-rich sediments formed under oxygen-depleted conditions, marks these deadly intervals. For the creatures trapped within, survival depended on finding refuges in oxygen-rich shallows, or evolving physiologies that could withstand scarcity. Each pulse of anoxia was a reset, pruning diversity yet also shaping resilience. In the harshness of these episodes, life discovered pathways of endurance that would echo in later ages of mass extinction and recovery. The fossil record captures not only bodies, but also the traces of behaviour etched into stone. Burrows, trails, and feeding marks record the daily struggles of Cambrian life. They reveal creatures that tunnelled through sediments, others that crawled across the seabed, still others that swam in looping arcs above. These trace fossils are often more abundant than the bodies themselves, for behaviour is harder to erase than flesh. They remind us that the Cambrian Explosion was not only about new anatomies, but about new ways of living: mobility, predation, cooperation, concealment. Each trace is a ghostly footprint of innovation, silent yet eloquent. Amid all this innovation, failures abounded. Entire lineages, represented by only a handful of fossils, vanished without descendants. Some bore anatomies so peculiar they defy classification, their strangeness preserved as evolutionary questions that may never be answered. Were they experiments cut short by competition, or survivors of earlier ages that could not withstand the new pressures? Each extinction created voids, and into those voids surged new forms, filling gaps and pushing ecosystems into ever greater intricacy. It was through this constant cycle of creation and loss that the Cambrian seas attained their richness. For us, looking back through the lens of deep time, the Cambrian world is both alien and familiar. Alien in its creatures, whose spines, eyes and appendages seem born of dream rather than reality. Familiar in its dynamics, where competition, cooperation and adaptation follow the same rules that still govern life today. The ecosystems of the Cambrian were the first drafts of the patterns that would dominate Earth's biosphere for 500 million years. Every reef, every forest, every grassland that followed carries echoes of these early seas, and yet the Cambrian was only the beginning. The burst of innovation it unleashed would resonate into the Ordovician, where marine life grew even more elaborate and into every subsequent age of Earth's history. What began as an explosion of forms in shallow seas became the foundation of entire kingdoms of life. The story of the Cambrian is not a closed chapter, but an overture, a reminder that complexity arises not in spite of struggle, but because of it. The same forces that once sculpted trilobites and opabinia still shape us today, though in forms unrecognisably altered by time. As the currents of this story pull us deeper, one question lingers like a shadow beneath the waves. If the Cambrian was a crucible of invention, what hidden forces still lie buried in the rock, waiting to reveal the secrets of how life learned to explode into possibility? The Cambrian seas were not quiet. They pulsed with movement, filled with creatures testing new ways of living, their bodies both tools and experiments. But to understand this explosion of forms, one must look not only at anatomy and environment, but at time itself. For the Cambrian was not a singular event. It was a long unfolding, stretching across millions of years, each layer of sediment preserving a fragment of the drama. Fossil beds scattered across the globe, Canada's Burgess Shale, China's Chengjiang, Greenland's Sirius Passet, are windows into this age, their stones holding memories of worlds no human eye had ever seen. Through them, we glimpse the deep truth. The Cambrian explosion was not chaos, but the first great conversation between life and Earth. The Chengjiang fossils, older than the Burgess Shale by some 10 million years, capture the earliest phase of this unfolding. Here we see delicate creatures, many preserved with astonishing detail. Soft-bodied worms, shrimp-like arthropods, primitive chordates with notochords, the flexible rods that would one day become the backbone of vertebrates. Among them is Milacun mingia, one of the first known fish-like animals, whose faint outline suggests the beginnings of muscles, a head, and primitive gills. This tiny creature, no longer than a finger, may represent the dawn of a lineage that would eventually lead to all vertebrates, including ourselves. To find such a fossil is to stand at the threshold of ancestry, staring into the fragile beginnings of our own story. In the Burgess Shale, preserved by a catastrophic mudslide, the diversity is even more staggering. Here, entire communities were entombed in fine silt, leaving behind not only skeletons but impressions of soft tissues, gills, and even stomach contents. The fossil record here reads like a catalogue of experiments. Wiwaxia, with its armour of scales and spines, Morella, a delicate arthropod with feathery limbs, and Nomalocaris, the giant predator whose presence dominated the ecosystem. These fossils tell us that the Cambrian explosion was not a uniform burst, but a series of surges, each ecosystem experimenting with new forms, each environment pushing evolution in different directions. The Sirius Passet in Greenland reveals yet another chapter, with creatures that combine primitive traits with startling innovations. Lobopodians, worm-like creatures with stubby clawed legs, crawled along the seabed, bridging the gap between earlier worms and later arthropods. Their flexible bodies and grasping limbs foreshadow the adaptability that would allow arthropods to conquer every environment on Earth. In Sirius Passet, one senses the early testing of body plans that would either vanish into extinction or echo forward into success. To walk through these fossil beds in imagination is to feel the layered rhythm of time, each deposit a stanza in the poem of life. The preservation of such fossils is itself a miracle. Most soft-bodied animals vanish quickly after death, dissolved by scavengers or decay. Only under rare conditions, rapid burial in oxygen, poor sediments, fine-grained mud that captures delicate impressions, do their forms survive. Without these accidents of geology, our view of the Cambrian would be limited to shells and bones, a fraction of the story. Instead, we're granted fleeting visions of entire ecosystems, as if nature itself conspired to preserve its experiments for distant eyes. Each fossil is a time capsule, fragile yet defiant, carrying whispers of lives extinguished 500 million years ago. Yet the fossils tell more than anatomy, they tell of behaviour. Some trilobite fossils are found in lines, suggesting group migration or coordinated movement. Others show injuries healed over time, evidence that even then survival meant resilience. Fossils of predators with stomachs filled reveal diets, while trace fossils, burrows, tracks and feeding marks, capture moments of daily life. These silent imprints remind us that the Cambrian explosion was not just a proliferation of forms, but of behaviours: digging, swimming, chasing, fleeing. It was the moment when ecosystems became theatres of action, rather than static collections of organisms. But with every discovery comes mystery. Why did so many Cambrian body plans vanish, leaving no descendants? Some paleontologists argue that these creatures were evolutionary experiments, unsuited to long-term survival. Others suggest they were outcompeted by more adaptable lineages, their niches absorbed into new forms. Whatever the cause, the Cambrian reminds us that extinction has always been the shadow companion of innovation. For every lineage that thrived, countless others ended in silence, leaving only strange fossils as testimony. Life does not march toward perfection. It stumbles, it tests, it fails, and in failure it clears the way for others. The Cambrian also challenges our assumptions about the pace of evolution. To human eyes, the appearance of so many new forms in a few tens of millions of years seems abrupt, explosive. But in geological time, the Cambrian explosion was not instantaneous. It was a gradual build-up, a cascade of changes amplified by feedback between environment and biology. Rising oxygen levels enabled larger bodies. Larger bodies demanded better circulatory systems. Better systems required new genetic regulation. And those new genes allowed even greater anatomical variety. Each step reinforced the next, creating an accelerating spiral of innovation. Seen this way, the Cambrian was not a miracle, but an inevitability, the moment when conditions aligned to unleash the potential long hidden in life's code. Still, the Cambrian does feel like a miracle when we imagine it. To picture those seas is to stand on the edge of strangeness. Forests of sponge-like organisms swaying in currents, trilobites marching across the sand, translucent swimmers flashing with sudden movement, predators gliding with silent menace. The water shimmered with possibilities, every form a question asked, every survival an answer. It was a world where the rules had not yet settled, where biology wrote itself in bold strokes, unafraid of failure. To witness it would be to watch creation itself in motion, raw and unpolished, fierce and beautiful. Perhaps what is most haunting is that we are connected to this world in ways we cannot escape. The chordates that swam in Chengjiang carried within them the first outlines of our spine, our muscles, our nervous systems. The genes that orchestrated Cambrian bodies still orchestrate ours, reshuffling the same ancient instructions. The patterns of ecosystems, predation, cooperation, escalation, still govern us, though in far more elaborate forms. To study the Cambrian is to study ourselves, not as we are, but as we once were, in a world that no longer exists, yet lives within every breath we take. And so the Cambrian beckons us deeper, beyond fossils and sediments, into the mystery of how life makes itself new. For if the explosion was a conversation between biology and Earth, it was also a prelude to everything that followed. The Ordovician seas, the rise of reefs, the spread of ecosystems onto land, all trace their roots to the Cambrians' restless invention. Each fossil is not only a relic but a seed, reminding us that what began here was not an ending but a beginning. And still the question flows forward like a tide. What unseen forces shape the next surge, carrying life from the cradle of the Cambrian into the wider theatres of deep time? The Cambrian Explosion was not simply a parade of creatures, it was a revolution in how life interacted with the planet itself. Before this time, Earth had been painted largely in microbial tones, a world where mats of cyanobacteria coated shallow waters, their photosynthesis quietly shaping the atmosphere. But with the arrival of complex animals, the relationship between life and environment deepened. Creatures no longer merely adapted to the Earth, they began to reshape it. The seafloor, the sediments, even the chemistry of the oceans bore the imprint of new behaviours, carving a feedback loop that pushed evolution forward in ways no earlier era had witnessed. One of the most profound changes came from burrowing animals. In the Ediacaran seas that preceded the Cambrian, microbial mats lay thick across the ocean floor, relatively undisturbed for hundreds of millions of years. But with the rise of worms and other burrowers, those mats were ripped apart, oxygen driven deeper into the sediment, and nutrients released into circulation. This process, bioturbation, was nothing less than the re-engineering of the seabed. The creatures that tunneled through mud were not just surviving, they were transforming the environment, making it less hospitable to the old microbial ecosystems and more favourable to animal life. The very foundation of the ocean's ecology shifted, setting the stage for modern marine systems. At the same time, predators forced prey to innovate. Trilobites developed hard shells, but this required minerals like calcium carbonate, which in turn altered ocean chemistry as shells accumulated, broke apart and sank to the seafloor. The debris of survival became sediment, layering the seabed with traces of biological invention. Spines, plates, and carapaces did more than protect bodies. They shaped the physical environment of the ocean floor. In this sense, the Cambrian explosion was not just biological, it was geological, leaving behind a fossilized landscape of battles and defenses. Evolution etched itself into stone, one exoskeleton at a time. As animals diversified, ecosystems became more stratified. Grazers consumed microbial films that had long dominated the seafloor, while filter feeders drew energy from drifting plankton. Scavengers and predators turned death into fuel, ensuring nothing went to waste. This recycling created stability amid chaos, binding organisms together in webs of dependency. No longer could life exist in isolation. Every survival strategy depended on another. The Cambrian explosion marked the first time ecosystems resembled the intricate balance we recognize today, where the fall of one species reverberates through many others. In this interwoven world, extinction and survival became collective phenomena, not merely individual fates, yet the Cambrian seas were far from gentle. Periods of low oxygen, recorded in black shale deposits, occasionally swept through, suffocating entire ecosystems. These noxic events may have acted as pruning tools, trimming diversity, but also encouraging resilience. Creatures that could endure such stresses gained advantages, and their descendants carried those strategies forward. These cycles of expansion and collapse mirrored patterns that would echo throughout Earth's history. Mass extinctions followed by bursts of innovation. In the Cambrian, the rhythm was already set, as if Earth itself were teaching life the harsh lesson of impermanence. Genetic innovation added another dimension. The Hox genes, already present but now flourishing, provided the scaffolding for new body plans. They regulated the development of segments, limbs, and sensory organs, allowing creatures to explore endless combinations. With these genes, evolution could rearrange the same building blocks in new configurations, creating predators with grasping appendages, grazers with armour, and swimmers with fins. This genetic toolkit remains within us even today, shaping the growth of human embryos with echoes of Cambrian seas. The explosion was not simply a flourish of external form, it was a deep rewriting of the possibilities coded within DNA. Amid this experimentation, some creatures appeared almost fantastical. Hallucigenia, spines bristling along its back, crept on spindly legs, a living riddle preserved in stone. Opabinia, with its 5 eyes and flexible proboscis, looked more like an artist's imagination than a natural organism, yet it thrived in its niche. Wiwaxia, armoured with overlapping scales and spines, shuffled across the seafloor like a living fortress. These creatures remind us that the Cambrian was an age when the boundaries of possibility had not yet narrowed. Evolution tested designs as though sketching wildly, discarding most but keeping a few that would ripple forward into time. The strange and the bizarre were not aberrations, they were the rule. The Cambrian world was also a place of energy and light. Shallow seas allowed sunlight to flood ecosystems, driving photosynthesis and fueling food chains from the bottom up. Algae and cyanobacteria bloomed in the surface waters, feeding plankton that drifted like invisible clouds. Filter feeders captured these drifting particles, while predators pursued those who captured them. The pyramid of life grew taller, more elaborate and more fragile. Every level supported the next, creating a precarious balance where abundance could collapse at any moment. And yet from this precariousness came resilience, for ecosystems that had learned to endure instability could withstand greater shocks in the future. The story of the Cambrian is written not only in fossils but in sediments that carry chemical signatures of ancient seas. Carbon isotopes reveal fluctuations in ocean chemistry, while trace elements hint at pulses of oxygen that enabled bursts of innovation. These invisible records complement the bones and shells, painting a broader picture of an Earth in flux. They remind us that biology and geology were inseparable partners, each shaping the other in a dance of cause and effect. Life altered the oceans in turn altered life. This reciprocity defined the Cambrian Explosion and has defined every chapter of Earth's story since. To picture this ancient world is to imagine a tapestry of contrasts. Sunlight slants through shallow waters, illuminating trilobites marching like armoured armies across rippled sand. Above them, transparent swimmers flicker in and out of vision, their bodies fragile yet swift. In the shadows, predators glide, compound eyes catching the faintest glimmer of movement. Beneath the surface, worms writhe through the sediment, their tunnels aerating the seabed. Every corner of this world is alive with motion, with interaction, with the ceaseless experiment of survival. It is a world at once alien and deeply familiar, for its dynamics still shape us. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Cambrian Explosion lies in its lesson about possibility. Life, given the right conditions, does not remain static. It erupts, explores, invents. Most experiments fail, but those that succeed rewrite the story of the planet. Without this age of invention, there would be no vertebrates, no forests, no humans. Our own existence is a thread woven through this ancient tapestry, our bodies carrying the marks of genes and structures first tested 500 million years ago. To walk the earth today is to carry the Cambrian within us, hidden yet undeniable. And so, as we follow the story deeper, we see that the Cambrian was not only the dawn of complexity but the dawn of resilience. It was the first rehearsal for the cycles of creation and destruction that would define Earth's history. The seas whispered with possibilities, each creature both fragile and monumental, each extinction both loss and opportunity. And as the sediments sealed their stories, it left us with a question that still echoes across time. What other wonders lie hidden in the stone, waiting to reveal the forgotten rhythms of life's first great explosion? The Cambrian seas, teeming with invention, were not only about the flourishing of new life, but also about the delicate interplay of survival and extinction. For every body plan that endured, countless others faded into silence, preserved only in the thin layers of shale or in the faint impressions left on ancient seabeds. To step into this time is to step into a world where success was fleeting, where adaptation was not a guarantee of longevity, but a temporary reprieve against the forces of change. The explosion of life was also an explosion of mortality, and within that cycle lay the seeds of resilience that would shape the history of all creatures to come. Extinction, often imagined as cataclysmic events sweeping across the globe, in the Cambrian often unfolded as quiet disappearances. Lineages that once thrived vanished without fanfare, their anatomies too specialized or their strategies too rigid to endure shifting environments. Creatures like the disc-shaped Eldonia or the ribbed fronds of Ediacaran survivors disappeared, leaving no descendants to carry their legacy forward. They remind us that the Cambrian was not simply a celebration of success, but a crucible of failure, where most experiments were abandoned. Yet in these failures lay opportunity, for when one lineage vanished, ecological space opened for another to expand. The seas were constantly reshaped by this give and take, a dynamic equilibrium of creation and loss. The pace of extinction and diversification in the Cambrian was accelerated by instability. Ocean chemistry, fluctuating with pulses of oxygen and minerals, favoured some creatures while dooming others. A sudden depletion of oxygen in deeper waters might suffocate entire communities, while an influx of nutrients could trigger blooms of life that altered food chains overnight. The fossil record bears silent witness to these swings, layers of black shale marking episodes when oxygen vanished, followed by bursts of diversity in subsequent strata. Life was tied to these rhythms, as dependent on the unseen chemistry of the seas as on its own innovations. To endure in the Cambrian was to endure unpredictability. Predation also shaped extinction. With the arrival of active hunters, passive organisms that could not defend themselves were swiftly erased. Soft-bodied creatures without armour or concealment fell prey to predators armed with claws, jaws, and eyes. Yet even among predators, failure was common. Anomalocaris, for all its power, may have been poorly adapted to piercing the shells of trilobites, its circular mouthplate prone to damage. Its lineage eventually disappeared, outcompeted by newer predators with more versatile anatomies. The arms race that fueled innovation also guaranteed obsolescence. Each adaptation carried within it the seeds of its own decline as new strategies emerged to overcome it. The Cambrian Explosion was not a steady climb upward, but a spiral where victory was temporary and extinction ever present. Still, extinction in the Cambrian was not merely destructive, it was creative. Every disappearance left behind ecological niches that others could exploit. When one group of grazers declined, another expanded into its role. When one predator faltered, others rose to dominance. This continual turnover generated resilience at the ecosystem level, ensuring that no single lineage could dominate unchecked. The Cambrian seas were dynamic, not only because of their diversity, but because of the constant reshuffling of roles within them. Life was already learning a principle that would echo through every age to come. Survival is not about permanence, but about adaptability to change. The fossil beds of this era offer haunting snapshots of these dynamics. In some deposits, we see clusters of trilobites preserved mid-molt, perhaps caught in storms that buried them suddenly. In others, we find predator and prey locked together, their struggle frozen in stone. Still others capture species that exist nowhere else, unique to a single layer of sediment, their entire evolutionary experiment lasting only a geological heartbeat. These fossils remind us of the fragility of existence, the razor's edge between flourishing and extinction. Each stone slab is both an archive of success and a gravestone of failure. Yet extinction also served as a filter, narrowing the wild diversity of the Cambrian into lineages that could endure across deep time. Many of the bizarre body plans, creatures with 5 eyes, spiny lobopodians, or strange radial symmetries, left no descendants. But the lineages that persisted, the arthropods, mollusks, echinoderms, and chordates, carried forward structures that would prove versatile enough to survive countless future challenges. In this way, extinction was both an ending and a shaping hand, pruning the tree of life into branches that could grow taller and broader. Without these early losses, the evolutionary story that led to modern life might never have taken root. The Cambrian also teaches us that extinction is not always fair or predictable. Chance played its role. A sudden mudslide might entomb an entire community, erasing it from the future. A shift in ocean currents might starve one lineage while feeding another. The survivors were not always the most complex, nor the strongest, nor the fastest, but often those most capable of enduring change. Evolution is not a narrative of triumph, but of contingency, where randomness and necessity intertwine. To study the Cambrian is to confront the humility of our own existence, for our lineage too might have vanished had circumstances tilted differently. Despite the shadows of extinction, the Cambrian remains a story of creativity. Each loss was counterbalanced by invention, each silence by new voices entering the evolutionary chorus. The resilience of life lay not in the permanence of any one form, but in the persistence of diversity itself. The more varied the ecosystem, the more buffers it had against catastrophe. Diversity was strength, and strength allowed life to persist even when individual lineages faltered. This principle, born in the Cambrian seas, remains true today, as modern ecosystems rely on their interconnected webs to withstand the pressures of change. To imagine this interplay is to picture a seafloor alive with drama. Trilobites scuttle across the sand, their numbers vast, yet each vulnerable to the swift attack of predators. Worms tunnel unseen beneath the surface, their presence changing the very chemistry of the sediment. Above, translucent swimmers glide, some destined to vanish without a trace, others to leave echoes across 500 million years. The beauty of this world lies not in its stability, but in its impermanence, a restless balance between creation and destruction. Every extinction was a reset, every innovation a gamble, and in the spaces between, ecosystems found resilience. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson of the Cambrian Explosion, that life thrives not despite extinction, but through it. The constant turnover of lineages, the pruning of fragile branches, ensured that the tree of life could grow stronger, its surviving roots deeper. What feels like loss at the scale of a species becomes renewal at the scale of an ecosystem. And so the Cambrian seas, filled with creatures alien to our eyes, carry within them the blueprint of survival itself. The legacy they leave is not only the forms that endured, but the resilience forged in the crucible of extinction. As we follow this story further into deep time, we see the pattern repeating, amplified in later ages when mass extinctions would wipe out vast portions of life, only for diversity to surge again in the aftermath. The Cambrian was the first rehearsal, the opening act in Earth's long drama of destruction and renewal, and as the sediment sealed away both the failures and the triumphs, they left us with a haunting question. In the endless cycles of extinction and survival, what hidden lineages rose briefly in brilliance, only to vanish forever into silence? The Cambrian Explosion was a story not only of creatures and ecosystems, but also of senses awakening. Before this period, life drifted in relative obscurity, most organisms blind, slow, and unfeeling to the world around them. The Cambrian changed that forever. With the rise of predators and prey locked in escalating contests, survival required more than armor or speed, it demanded perception. For the first time, the oceans filled with sight, touch, and response. A sensory awakening that altered the very experience of existence. In the shimmering waters of 500 million years ago, life did not simply move, it began to see, to sense, to react with purpose. The evolution of vision was one of the most dramatic breakthroughs. Trilobites developed compound eyes, each made of dozens to hundreds of tiny lenses carved from calcite crystal. These eyes transformed the seafloor into a landscape of patterns and motion, allowing trilobites to detect predators and prey with startling efficiency. Fossils reveal variations in their eye structures, from wide-angle vision suited for scanning open water to forward-facing lenses adapted for precision hunting. With sight, the world became dynamic. Shadows hinted at danger, flashes of movement at opportunity. For the first time, survival was tied not only to what an organism was, but to what it could perceive. Predators, too, wielded vision as a weapon. Anomalocaris possessed some of the most advanced compound eyes of its time, each composed of thousands of lenses. With these, it could track movement in detail, homing in on trilobites and soft-bodied prey. To imagine being seen by such eyes is to imagine the ocean itself watching, every ripple and shift under scrutiny. This predator's dominance lay not just in strength but in awareness, and its reign was built on the ability to interpret the light filtering through Cambrian waters. Vision was no longer an advantage for a few. It was the currency of survival, and those without it were forced into shadows, burrows, or extinction. But vision was not the only sense awakening. Nervous systems grew more complex, enabling quicker reactions and coordinated movements. Simple networks of nerves gave way to centralized clusters that functioned like primitive brains, allowing animals to process stimuli and respond with precision. Some creatures developed sensitive hairs to detect vibrations in the water, while others honed chemical senses to track prey or mates. These sensory innovations opened new dimensions of interaction, transforming the Cambrian seas into arenas of pursuit, evasion, and communication. Life was no longer blind instinct. It was beginning to interpret, to choose, to engage with the world in layered ways. The emergence of these senses changed the architecture of ecosystems. Prey that could see and flee created pressure on predators to become faster and more cunning. Burrowers, sensing vibrations, avoided attack by retreating deeper into the sediment. Filter feeders detected chemical signals of plankton blooms and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Each sensory advance reshaped the dynamics of survival, creating feedback loops that propelled evolution forward. In this sense, the Cambrian Explosion was as much about information as it was about anatomy. The rise of creatures that could gather, process, and act on signals from their environment. Trace fossils provide evidence of these new behaviors. Complex burrows reveal animals that navigated sediments with intention, weaving networks that suggest awareness of danger and opportunity. Fossilized trackways show creatures altering their direction suddenly, as though responding to unseen stimuli. Even the arrangement of fossil communities hints at sensory awareness, with some species clustering in patterns that suggest communication or coordinated movement. These subtle clues remind us that the Cambrian Explosion was not only about bodies, it was about minds, however primitive, awakening to possibility. Yet with awareness came new forms of vulnerability. To see was to be seen. To sense vibrations was to betray presence. The Cambrian seas became arenas of deception as much as detection. Camouflage emerged, with some creatures adopting colours and patterns that blended into the seabed. Others mimic the textures of microbial mats, hiding in plain sight. The interplay between detection and concealment added a new layer of complexity, ensuring that survival was never guaranteed, no matter how sophisticated the senses became. The game of life had acquired new rules still written into ecosystems today. These sensory revolutions also altered reproduction and social behaviour. Creatures began to use chemical cues to find mates, ensuring that their lineage continued amid the chaos. Some trilobite fossils suggest mass molting events, perhaps linked to coordinated reproduction, with individuals gathering in large numbers for safety. Such behaviours hint at early forms of sociality, where senses were used not only for survival against predators, but also for connection and continuity. The Cambrian seas, for all their violence, were also places where life learned to seek others, to respond not only to threats, but to opportunities for renewal. The awakening of senses also opened pathways toward complexity far beyond the Cambrian. The compound eyes of trilobites laid groundwork for the vision of insects, crustaceans, and even, indirectly, vertebrates. These centralized nerve clusters of primitive worms foreshadowed brains capable of thought. The ability to detect chemical signals set the stage for communication that would one day lead to language. In the Cambrian, these were only the faintest beginnings, but they carried within them the seeds of everything that would follow. To study this period is to study the origins of perception itself, the first stirrings of awareness that would culminate in consciousness. Still, much remains uncertain. Fossils preserve bodies but rarely preserve senses directly. The compound eyes of trilobites are clear enough, but what of the chemical senses, the vibrations, the primitive neural networks? These we infer from trace fossils, from comparisons with modern relatives, from the faintest imprints of soft tissues in exceptional deposits. The Cambrian invites us to imagine beyond stone, to reconstruct not only how creatures looked but how they experienced their world. What did it mean to be a trilobite scanning a seafloor of dangers? What was it to be a worm sensing vibrations of an approaching predator? These questions remind us that the Cambrian is not only a biological puzzle, but an imaginative one, demanding that we bridge evidence and wonder. The sensory awakening of the Cambrian teaches us something profound about evolution, that innovation is not only about building new structures, but about unlocking new ways of relating to the world. A shell protects the body, but an eye transforms the environment. A jaw captures food, but a nerve cluster interprets possibility. These leaps extend beyond survival. They redefine what life is. In the Cambrian, life became aware of life, and from that awareness flowed a cascade of complexity that still shapes us today. And so the Cambrian seas shimmer before us, not only with bodies, but with perception. Shadows drift across the sand as trilobites scuttle in formation, their eyes reflecting light like fractured jewels. Above, predators glide, their compound eyes fixed on movement below. Burrowers vanish into tunnels at the faintest vibration, while spiny creatures lie motionless, camouflaged against the seabed. Every gesture, every pause, is guided by senses newly born, the first tentative steps toward awareness. It was not yet consciousness as we know it, but it was the beginning of seeing, of feeling, of reacting with intent. The story carries us forward, toward questions even deeper than anatomy or ecology. If the Cambrian was the dawn of perception, how did these sensory awakenings lead to the rise of intelligence? What pathways connected the eyes of trilobites to the thoughts of humans? As the sediment sealed these ancient experiments, it left us only fragments of an answer, fragments that still shimmer with mystery. And in the silence of those stones lies the next great question. When did life not only see, but begin to think? The Cambrian Explosion was a revolution in form, function, and perception, but hidden within its depths was another transformation, one that reached beyond anatomy and senses into the very structure of time. For the first time in Earth's history, ecosystems developed rhythms, cycles of activity, reproduction, and interaction that created patterns across generations. What had once been a planet of static microbial mats and passive drifters was now alive with seasons of birth and death, migrations, and coordinated behaviours. The Cambrian was not only an explosion of diversity, but an awakening of tempo, the first great choreography of life in motion. Reproduction became the foundation of these rhythms. Fossil evidence suggests that many Cambrian organisms released vast numbers of eggs and larvae into the water, a strategy known as broadcast spawning. Clouds of tiny drifting life filled the seas, invisible armies of possibility carried by currents. Most perished quickly, consumed by filter feeders or lost to chance, but a fraction survived to settle on the seafloor and grow into adults. This abundance ensured that lineages endured even in the face of predation and environmental upheaval. It was not precision but persistence that secured survival, the flood of offspring overwhelming the odds. In this sense, the Cambrian oceans were nurseries as much as battlefields, their waters shimmering with beginnings as well as endings. Larval stages added another layer of complexity. Unlike adults, which often crawled or burrowed on the seafloor, larvae drifted in open water, spreading species across wide distances. This dispersal prevented ecosystems from becoming isolated, blending genetic diversity across vast regions. The ocean's currents became invisible highways of inheritance, carrying microscopic travellers from one cradle of life to another. For the first time, reproduction and dispersal intertwined, ensuring not only continuity but expansion. Life was no longer tied to single places but flowed across seas, knitting distant habitats into a larger interconnected whole. The rhythms of life were also tied to environmental cues. Seasonal changes in temperature and light, driven by Earth's orbit and axial tilt, influenced blooms of plankton at the base of the food web. In response, filter feeders flourished in pulses, predators followed prey migrations, and reproductive cycles aligned with periods of abundance. Though primitive, these patterns laid the groundwork for the ecological timing that still governs modern seas. The Cambrian was a world where life began to listen to the planet's clock, syncing its own rhythms with those of Earth itself. Predation added urgency to these cycles. To molt, trilobites had to shed their exoskeletons, leaving them vulnerable for brief intervals. Fossil beds capture mass molting events, with clusters of empty shells suggesting that trilobites gathered together, perhaps for safety in numbers. These gatherings may have been synchronized, triggered by environmental signals such as lunar cycles or tides. If true, they represent one of the earliest examples of collective behavior in animals, where individuals coordinated their actions in response to shared risks. In these gatherings, we glimpse the faint outlines of sociality, the first whispers of cooperation amid the noise of competition. The Cambrian seas also revealed the beginnings of symbiosis. Fossils hint at reef-like structures where sponges, algae, and filter feeders lived together, creating miniature ecosystems that sheltered smaller animals. These partnerships suggest that even in this early age, survival was not only about competition, but also about collaboration. By providing shelter or food, some organisms shaped niches that others could exploit, strengthening entire communities. This was the first faint sketch of the ecological networks that would later dominate coral reefs, forests, and grasslands. The Cambrian explosion was not simply a proliferation of bodies. It was the emergence of relationships that transcended individuals. Still, the fragility of these rhythms is clear in the fossil record. Sudden mudslides, storms, or oxygen crashes could annihilate entire communities in an instant, burying their synchronized lives beneath silt. The Burgess Shale preserves just such catastrophes, an entire ecosystem frozen mid-motion, predators and prey alike caught in the same breath of time. These mass deaths reveal how precarious existence was, how easily the choreography of life could be silenced by geological upheaval. And yet, the persistence of patterns across millions of years shows that life's rhythms were not accidents, but strategies, resilient enough to endure even repeated disruption. The Cambrian cycles of reproduction, dispersal, and interaction also shaped the course of evolution itself. Lineages that mastered timing, releasing larvae during plankton blooms, molting in synchrony, seeking mates when conditions were favourable, had advantages that echoed across generations. Evolution rewarded not only form and function but also timing, embedding rhythms into biology. These rhythms persist in us today, in the circadian clocks that govern our sleep, in the seasonal migrations of birds, in the synchronized spawning of corals under moonlight. Their origins stretch back to the Cambrian seas, where life first danced to the cadence of Earth's cycles. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these rhythms is their role in resilience. Extinction was rampant in the Cambrian, yet lineages that reproduced abundantly and dispersed widely had better chances of enduring. Even when local populations vanished, larvae carried by currents could repopulate empty habitats. Diversity itself became insurance, spreading risk across space and time. The Cambrian Explosion teaches us that resilience is not about avoiding catastrophe, but about absorbing it, weaving survival into cycles that can withstand disruption. In this way, the rhythms of life were not only biological but philosophical. An early lesson that persistence comes from embracing change rather than resisting it. Imagining these seas, one sees more than creatures in isolation. Picture trilobites scuttling in herds across the seabed, their synchronized molts leaving fields of discarded shells. Above them, clouds of larvae drift in shimmering swarms, carried by currents to distant shores. Sponges and reef builders create havens where smaller animals cluster, while predators patrol the edges, their movements timed to the gatherings of prey. The water is filled not with chaos but with cadence, a vast choreography of feeding, reproduction and survival. Each creature moves to rhythms older than memory, their lives shaped by cycles that will echo into every future ecosystem. The Cambrian Explosion, then, was not only an event of bodies and senses, but of time itself. Life discovered tempo, pattern, repetition, and resilience through cycles. The seas became arenas not only of invention but of coordination, where the flow of generations became as important as the form of individuals. This was the beginning of ecology in its fullest sense, not just interactions of species, but the weaving of those interactions into rhythms aligned with Earth's own pulse. As we descend deeper into this story, we see that these rhythms were not the end of innovation, but the foundation for the next great steps in life's history. For beyond the Cambrian lay worlds even stranger, where ecosystems would expand, collapse, and expand again, testing the limits of resilience. And so the question drifts forward on the currents of time. How did these first rhythms carry life into the ages that followed, guiding survival through the storms and silences of Earth's unfolding drama? The Cambrian Explosion has long captivated paleontologists because it seems to embody a paradox. An event both sudden and inevitable, both chaotic and patterned. For nearly 3 billion years, life had moved slowly, experimenting only at the microbial scale, until suddenly an avalanche of forms burst into existence. To understand why this occurred, one must look not only at fossils but also at the invisible frameworks of genetics and development. Beneath the shells and spines, beneath the eyes and claws, there was a hidden revolution within the architecture of DNA itself. The Cambrian was not only the explosion of bodies, it was the explosion of possibilities encoded in the genetic language of life. At the heart of this genetic transformation were the Hox genes, a set of developmental regulators that determine the body plan of animals. These genes act like master switches, instructing where limbs, eyes, and segments should form along the body. In earlier life, body plans were simple, repetitive, limited to structures that mirrored each other without much specialization. But in the Cambrian, Hox genes multiplied and diversified, giving organisms the flexibility to experiment with entirely new anatomies. A slight change in one gene's expression might elongate a segment, produce a pair of appendages, or create a new region of the body. Suddenly, evolution was not limited to minor adjustments. It could rearrange the blueprint of life itself. This genetic toolkit made possible the diversity of forms preserved in fossil beds, like the Burgess Shale and Changjiang. The spiny armour of Hallucigenia, the grasping limbs of Anomalocaris, the feather-like appendages of Marella. All were products of developmental innovations controlled by these genes. Even the earliest chordates, with their primitive notochords and gill structures, reflect the influence of genetic instructions that would one day shape vertebrate spines and skulls. The Cambrian Explosion was, in a sense, the first grand improvisation of the Hox Orchestra, a symphony of rearrangements that produced both masterpieces and discarded drafts. Yet genes alone do not explain the timing of this explosion. Hox genes likely existed in simpler forms long before the Cambrian, perhaps even in Ediacaran organisms that left behind ghostly impressions on sandstone. Why then did complexity suddenly surge? One answer lies in the interplay between genetics and environment. The presence of a genetic toolkit does not guarantee innovation, it merely provides the capacity. Environmental pressures, the rise of predators, the influx of oxygen, the new availability of minerals acted as triggers, demanding responses that tapped into these latent genetic possibilities. It was as if Earth itself pressed the keys of the genetic instrument, coaxing out melodies that had long been waiting to play. Molecular evidence from living animals supports this view. Modern arthropods, mollusks, and vertebrates all share deeply conserved Hox genes, inherited from ancestors that lived during or before the Cambrian. By studying how these genes function in embryonic development, scientists can glimpse echoes of Cambrian experimentation. A gene that positions wings in insects might once have arranged limbs in trilobite-like ancestors. A gene that shapes vertebrate ribs might have first patterned the flexible bodies of Cambrian worms. In this sense, the Cambrian explosion is not only recorded in fossils but written into the DNA of every animal alive today, a hidden archive of evolutionary invention. But genes alone cannot capture the drama of this time. The Cambrian was also a world of constraints, where not every possibility could be realized. Developmental pathways, once established, limited the directions organisms could take. Just as architecture depends on both creativity and structural rules, evolution depended on both genetic flexibility and physical feasibility. Not every mutation was viable. Not every arrangement could survive. This tension between possibility and constraint shaped the strange mix of creatures we see in the fossil record. Some bizarre experiments doomed to vanish, others versatile enough to persist across eons. The Cambrian explosion was not just a celebration of novelty, but a negotiation between imagination and practicality. One striking aspect of this negotiation is the balance between modularity and integration. Modular body parts, segments, limbs, eyes, could evolve independently, allowing variation without disrupting the whole organism. But integration, how these parts work together, was equally important. A predator could not simply evolve powerful claws. It needed muscles to operate them, nerves to control them, and senses to guide them. Each innovation demanded coordination, weaving genetic instructions into functional unity. The Cambrian was, in this sense, a workshop not only of parts but of systems, testing how new modules could fit together into cohesive bodies. The fossil record also hints at the failures of this workshop. Some Cambrian organisms appear so alien that scientists struggle to place them within the tree of life. Were they distant relatives of arthropods, mollusks, or chordates? Or were they entirely separate experiments that left no descendants? These unresolved forms are reminders that the Cambrian explosion was not only about the ancestors of modern animals, but also about lost branches, evolutionary paths that ended abruptly. Their strange anatomies, five-eyed hunters, armoured worms, creatures with radial symmetry unlike any modern phylum, testify to the breadth of experimentation. Each represents a question unanswered, a possibility unfulfilled, yet their existence enriches our understanding of evolution's creative scope. The Cambrian also invites reflection on contingency. If the explosion was enabled by genetic toolkits, environmental triggers, and ecological interactions, could it have happened differently? Might other body plans have endured, leading to a biosphere utterly unlike our own? The fossil record suggests that chance played a powerful role. A lineage that survived one extinction pulse might flourish, while another, equally innovative, might vanish. Our own lineage, the chordates, was among the fragile survivors, their early forms rare in Cambrian deposits. Had they perished, vertebrates might never have arisen, and the history of Earth would have unfolded without fish, reptiles, birds, or humans. In this sense, the Cambrian explosion is both a story of inevitability and of luck. For us, living in the present, the Cambrian teaches a profound lesson, that life's complexity is not the product of steady progress, but of bursts of possibility released under the right conditions. The genes that shape our hands and eyes were once tools for trilobites and worms, tested in ancient seas where predators hunted in darkness and prey burrowed in panic. We carry within us the legacy of those experiments, the survivors etched into our own DNA. The Cambrian explosion was not just a distant event, but the foundation of what it means to be animal, to have bodies capable of movement, sensation, and awareness. To imagine this hidden revolution is to see not only the fossils, but the invisible instructions they embody. Picture the shallow seas of the Cambrian as vast laboratories of form, where genes orchestrated bodies like sculptors working in living clay. Trilobites scuttled with eyes formed by crystal, worms burrowed with muscles wired to primitive nerve cords, and predators scanned the water with lenses shaped by DNA. Each movement, each interaction, was the expression of genetic blueprints that had only recently been unlocked. The ocean was filled not just with creatures, but with possibilities, each body a hypothesis tested against survival. And yet, the Cambrian leaves us with mysteries unresolved. How exactly did these genetic innovations align with environmental triggers? Why did so many experiments vanish while a few endured? How much of the explosion was written into DNA, and how much was shaped by chance and catastrophe? These questions echo through paleontology, genetics, and philosophy alike, reminding us that the Cambrian is not merely history but inquiry. It asks us to consider the forces that make life not only possible but diverse, not only resilient but endlessly inventive. As we move forward through deep time, the Cambrian explosion stands as both foundation and prelude. The innovations it unleashed would ripple into the Ordovician and beyond, shaping reefs, ecosystems, and the conquest of land. But its deepest legacy lies within us, in the hidden instructions of our own cells, in the genetic symphony first played 500 million years ago. And so the question carries onward, insistent as a tide. What further inventions, what hidden potentials, awaited life in the unfolding ages beyond the Cambrian seas? The Cambrian explosion was not only about the rise of individual creatures or the unlocking of genetic blueprints, it was also about the invention of communities, the weaving together of organisms into ecosystems that mirrored the interdependence of modern life. In this age, the seas became complex networks where no creature lived entirely alone, where every adaptation carried ripples outward to reshape the possibilities of others. To understand the Cambrian is to see not a series of disconnected marvels, but a fabric of interactions, fragile yet fertile, whose threads created resilience and vulnerability alike. On the shallow sea floors, microbial mats that had dominated for eons became canvases for new activity. Trilobites grazed across them in endless numbers, carving patterns like herds of ancient cattle. Their movement disrupted the mats, which had once lain undisturbed, forcing microbes to adapt by forming more resistant colonies. Worms tunneling beneath these surfaces transformed sediments into oxygen-rich layers, releasing nutrients that fueled other organisms. This was the beginning of ecosystem engineering, not deliberate but consequential. Each action, born of survival, remade the environment for others. The Cambrian world was alive not only with bodies but with consequences, every creature an agent of change. Reef-like structures began to appear, constructed by sponges, algae, and early reef builders. These primitive reefs were not yet the vast coral bastions of later ages, but they created complexity in space. Nooks, crannies, and surfaces for smaller animals to occupy. Filter feeders perched within these reefs, siphoning plankton from passing currents, while predators lurked nearby to exploit the gathering crowds. Such reefs represented the first architecture of community, places where life created habitats for itself rather than relying solely on the contours of geology. They reveal an important truth about the Cambrian explosion, that it was as much about relationships as about forms. Predator-prey interactions stitch these ecosystems together with threads of tension. A trilobite grazing peacefully was also food for Anomalocaris, whose swift attack created cascades of response. Armour thickened, spines lengthened, burrowing became deeper. These adaptations reshaped the seafloor, altering the resources available to others. The predator did not simply consume, it sculpted the evolutionary landscape. Likewise, the prey did not only defend, it forced predators to evolve sharper senses and more efficient limbs. This interplay turned ecosystems into dynamic arenas of escalation, where stability was always temporary and innovation perpetual. Scavengers played a quieter but equally crucial role. When predators left scraps or when storms buried communities, scavengers arrived to recycle the remains. Their feeding prevented the build-up of decay and returned nutrients to circulation, ensuring the ecosystem did not collapse under its own abundance. Even in this early age, ecosystems demonstrated a principle that still governs them today. Waste becomes resource, and death sustains life. The Cambrian seas, for all their violence, were also places of continuity, where cycles of energy flowed endlessly from one form to another. Fossil evidence shows signs of clustering behaviour, particularly among trilobites. In some deposits, they are preserved in lines or groups, as if they travelled together across the seafloor. Were these migrations in search of food, coordinated responses to tides, or strategies for safety in numbers? Whatever the cause, such patterns suggest that even simple creatures engaged in collective behaviour. The Cambrian may have witnessed the first faint shadows of sociality, the recognition, genetic or instinctual, that survival could be enhanced through togetherness. In these clusters lie the earliest echoes of herds, schools and swarms, patterns that would dominate ecosystems for millions of years to come. Yet communities were not only about cooperation, they were also about conflict over shared resources. Burrowers that oxygenated the seafloor created opportunities for some species, but destroyed habitats for others dependent on microbial mats. Grazers competed for the same patches of algae, forcing species to specialize in different strategies or times of feeding. The Cambrian explosion was thus not only an expansion of diversity, but also a negotiation of coexistence, where niches were carved not just by invention but by competition. These negotiations often left behind winners and losers, with some lineages flourishing and others extinguished in silence. The emergence of communities also meant the beginning of ecological balance. When predators became too successful, prey populations collapsed, leading to starvation for the hunters. When grazers overwhelmed microbial mats, their own food supplies dwindled, forcing a check on their numbers. These cycles of boom and bust mirrored patterns that would echo throughout Earth's history, from ancient seas to modern savannas. The Cambrian explosion teaches us that ecosystems, even in their earlier stages, were self-regulating, governed by the push and pull of interdependence. What makes the Cambrian particularly fascinating is that many of these principles unfolded for the very first time. Before this age, life had been largely microbial, existing in thin layers with little complexity of interaction. But now energy flowed through food webs that spanned multiple levels, from plankton at the base to apex predators at the top. The architecture of modern ecosystems, producers, consumers, decomposers, was born in these seas. Every reef, forest and grassland that would follow traces its ancestry to these early networks of exchange. Still, the Cambrian world was precarious. Communities depended on delicate balances, easily disrupted by shifts in climate or chemistry. A drop in oxygen could devastate predators, while a shift in nutrient flows could collapse plankton populations and ripple upward through food webs. The fossil record captures moments of such collapse, when diversity waned and ecosystems reset. Yet even in these failures, resilience was visible. Lineages that endured filled empty niches, and ecosystems reorganized into new configurations. This cycle of collapse and renewal, so central to the history of life, was already at play 500 million years ago. To imagine these communities is to picture a seafloor alive with contrasts. Trilobites cluster together in lines, their eyes scanning the dim light. Worms burrow beneath, stirring the sediment, while filter feeders anchor to primitive reefs, their feathery limbs fanning the water. Above, predators glide with alien grace, their compound eyes alert to the smallest flicker of movement. Scavengers linger at the edges waiting for opportunities, while plankton drift invisibly in the currents, the foundation of it all. Each life, fragile in itself, becomes part of a greater web, threads woven so tightly that no motion occurs without consequence. The Cambrian explosion in this light was not a sudden burst of novelty scattered randomly across the seas. It was the birth of interconnectedness, the invention of ecological systems where survival was never solitary. Each creature carried not only its own fate but the fate of many others, bound together in webs that mirrored the complexity of Earth itself. The fossils we unearth today are not only skeletons of individuals but fragments of relationships, echoes of vanished communities that once pulsed with energy and interaction. And yet, these communities were only the beginning. They laid the groundwork for ecosystems of greater scale and stability in the Ordovician seas, where reefs would expand and biodiversity would reach new heights. The Cambrian was the overture, a first rehearsal in the grand symphony of ecological complexity. Its rhythms were fragile, its experiments often fleeting, but its legacy was enduring. For from these first woven webs came every system of life that followed, each more elaborate yet built upon the same ancient principles. As we drift forward into this story, the question emerges like a tide pulling at the shore. If the Cambrian was the dawn of communities, how did those fragile beginnings give rise to the vast, intricate networks that would dominate the world in the ages to come? The Cambrian Explosion was a triumph of invention, but invention rarely comes without risk. For every creature that thrived in those restless seas, there were others that faltered, their designs too fragile or too peculiar to survive the trials of time. Fossils from this age capture not only the flourishing of diversity, but also the silence of disappearance. In these vanishing forms, we see the truth that evolution is not progress toward perfection, but a ceaseless experiment, where most attempts end in failure and only a few endure. The Cambrian was therefore both cradle and grave, a place where creativity met the harsh filter of survival. Among the most haunting fossils of this age are those that defy classification, creatures so alien that they appear more like dreams than ancestors. Some possessed bodies fringed with spines, but lacked clear organs for feeding or movement. Others had radial symmetries unlike any modern animal, their forms resembling wheels or stars pressed into stone. These organisms may have been evolutionary cul-de-sacs, viable for a time but unable to adapt to the pressures of predation, oxygen fluctuation, or competition. Their extinction was swift, but their brief existence left behind fossils that remind us of evolution's breadth, of how much was tried before the lineages of today found stability. Even successful groups endured constant pruning. Trilobites, though abundant and diverse, often suffered mass die-offs, their numbers collapsing when conditions shifted. Their fossil record is filled with scars, bite marks, healed injuries, and crushed exoskeletons that speak of relentless predation and environmental stress. Some trilobite lineages vanished in the Cambrian itself, unable to keep pace with the escalation of predators. Others adapted, radiating into dozens of forms that would persist for hundreds of millions of years. Their story illustrates the fine line between persistence and disappearance, a line walked by every creature of the Cambrian world. Predators themselves were not immune to extinction. Anomalocaris, once the terror of shallow seas, eventually lost its dominance. Its circular mouth, though formidable, may not have been efficient enough to crush the thickening armour of trilobites and other prey. As prey hardened, predators had to adapt in turn, and some failed to do so. The disappearance of Anomalocaris reminds us that even apex hunters are subject to the same pressures as their prey. No design, however powerful, guarantees permanence in a world where innovation is constant and the rules change with every generation. Environmental instability amplified these losses. The Cambrian seas were dynamic, prone to fluctuations in oxygen, temperature, and nutrient levels. Sudden pulses of anoxia, oxygen depletion, devastated ecosystems, especially in deeper waters. Entire communities suffocated, leaving behind black shells rich with organic remains. For those species unable to retreat to shallower refuges, extinction was total. These environmental filters acted ruthlessly, wiping out not only the fragile but also the unlucky. Survival was as much about resilience as it was about chance, and sometimes even the most adaptable forms were caught in events beyond their control. The fossil record also reveals the transience of body plans that seemed extraordinary. Hallucigenia, with its spines and strange gait, left no descendants, though it may have shared ancestry with velvet worms still alive today. Opabinia, with its 5 eyes and grasping proboscis, vanished entirely, its lineage ending as abruptly as it began. These creatures appear to us as evolutionary curiosities, yet they were part of the grand experiment that tested the limits of possibility. Their extinction does not diminish their significance. Rather, it highlights the openness of evolution, its willingness to try designs that may not stand the test of time. Without such failures, the range of potential would have been narrower, and the survivors fewer. Extinction also reshaped ecosystems by opening opportunities for others. When one lineage vanished, its niche became available for another to occupy. The disappearance of soft-bodied grazers cleared the way for armoured trilobites to dominate. The fall of one predator created space for others to rise. This cycle of loss and replacement ensured that ecosystems remained dynamic, never frozen in a single configuration. The Cambrian Explosion was thus not a static burst of novelty, but a fluid, shifting landscape where extinction was as creative as invention. Death cleared the stage so that new forms could emerge, fueling the constant renewal of diversity. Yet extinction also left behind absences we can still feel. Whole branches of the evolutionary tree were cut away, leaving us to wonder what worlds might have arisen had they endured. What would life look like if creatures like Opabinia or Hallucigenia had flourished instead of fading? Would ecosystems today be filled with 5-eyed predators or forests of spiny walkers? These questions haunt paleontology, reminding us that history is shaped as much by what is lost as by what survives. The Cambrian Explosion is not only a story of what was gained, but of what was forever erased. The beauty of this age lies partly in its impermanence. Fossils from places like the Burgess Shale show us not only creatures in their prime, but creatures caught mid-collapse, their lineages already sliding into oblivion. We see ecosystems frozen at moments of catastrophe, predators and prey entombed together, their struggles silenced in an instant. These fossils capture the fragility of life, the reality that even in times of abundance, extinction is never far away. The Cambrian Explosion, for all its vibrancy, was shadowed by continual disappearance, and that shadow is as integral to its legacy as its light. To picture this world is to imagine a sea filled with contrasts. Swarms of trilobites crawl across the seabed, but among them lie shells already abandoned, the remains of those who failed. Predators glide through the currents, yet some carry broken appendages, scars of battles lost as well as won. Burrowers dig in silence, reshaping the sediment, but many tunnels end abruptly, sealed by mudslides that claimed their builders. The Cambrian seas shimmer with vitality, yet beneath every movement lies the quiet certainty of mortality. Life and death were inseparable, bound in rhythms that shaped the trajectory of evolution itself. The lesson of the Cambrian is that extinction is not simply an end but a sculptor. It prunes excess, redirects energy, and shapes the survivors into forms more resilient and adaptable. Without extinction, the diversity of today would not exist, for the tree of life would be overgrown with failed experiments. The Cambrian teaches us that impermanence is not failure, but foundation, that the silence of vanished lineages is as vital to the story as the voices that remain. In its absences, we glimpse the fragility of survival and the contingency of our own existence. And so, as we trace these vanished forms, we are reminded that the Cambrian explosion was not a moment of perfection, but a moment of possibility, where failure was as abundant as success. The fossils left behind are both records and reminders, fragments of a world where creation and erasure walked hand in hand. As we move deeper into the story toward the ages that followed, we must ask, what new patterns arose from this dance of survival and disappearance? And how did extinction itself become the engine of life's enduring resilience? The Cambrian explosion is remembered for its dazzling array of body plans and strange anatomies, but beneath those physical marvels lay a deeper transformation, the rise of ecosystems capable of stability through complexity. Until this time, Earth had known life as scattered colonies of microbes or isolated experiments in multicellularity, but never as a fully interwoven system. In the Cambrian, that changed. The seas became arenas where not only individuals but entire communities developed resilience by balancing competition, cooperation, and the recycling of energy. It was the dawn of ecology in its most intricate sense, and its principles would echo into every age that followed. At the base of these ecosystems were producers, cyanobacteria, algae, and plankton, that captured sunlight and converted it into energy. For billions of years, these organisms had been the quiet architects of Earth's biosphere, generating oxygen and forming mats on shallow sea floors. But now, with the proliferation of consumers, they became the foundation of layered food webs. Grazers scraped microbial films from the seabed, while filter feeders harvested drifting plankton. These roles, though humble, were indispensable, for without them the vast pyramid of Cambrian life would have collapsed. Energy flowed upward from these producers, feeding not just trilobites and worms, but the predators that stalked them. Predators gave the Cambrian seas their dynamism. With eyes, claws, and speed, they forced prey to adapt in ways that redefined entire ecosystems. Anomalocaris, with its compound eyes and grasping appendages, was the emblem of this transformation. Its presence at the top of food chains drove prey into burrows, forced armor to harden, and gave rise to spines and defensive behaviors. In this sense, predators were not simply destroyers, but shapers of balance. By keeping populations of grazers and scavengers in check, they prevented ecosystems from tipping into collapse. Predation, often imagined as brutal, was also a form of regulation, ensuring that no single group could dominate unchecked. Scavengers and decomposers played the quiet but essential role of recyclers. They consumed the remains left behind by predators or washed into the seabed by storms. By doing so, they prevented the stagnation of decay and returned nutrients into circulation. Worms, for instance, not only fed on organic material but also oxygenated sediments as they burrowed, reshaping the chemistry of the seafloor. Their invisible work kept ecosystems alive, sustaining cycles that allowed diversity to flourish. This principle, that death feeds life, was not invented in the Cambrian, but it became woven into the structure of complex communities for the first time. Reefs represent another innovation of this era. Built by sponges and early reef-forming organisms, they created stable frameworks that sheltered smaller creatures. Within their porous walls, plankton drifted into filters, while predators patrolled the edges, capitalizing on the abundance. These early reefs foreshadowed the vast coral systems that would one day dominate Earth's oceans, but even in their primitive form, they embodied the essence of ecology, life creating the conditions for more life. By shaping habitats, they multiplied opportunities for survival, allowing ecosystems to diversify not only in species but in function. Still, the Cambrian world was far from static. Ecosystems were delicate, perpetually tested by environmental instability. Oxygen levels fluctuated, and episodes of anoxia could devastate communities in deeper waters. Storms stirred sediments, burying entire populations in sudden avalanches. Volcanic eruptions injected minerals into the seas, altering chemistry overnight. In these moments, balance collapsed and ecosystems had to rebuild. Extinction was not merely background noise but an ever-present possibility, and survival required systems resilient enough to recover. The Cambrian Explosion, then, was not only a burst of innovation but a rehearsal for the cycles of collapse and renewal that would punctuate life's history. The complexity of Cambrian ecosystems also created vulnerability. As food webs grew taller, with multiple layers of consumers, they became more efficient but also more fragile. The loss of a key group, plankton blooms disrupted, trilobite populations thinned, predators wiped out, could cascade through the system, threatening collapse. Fossil evidence suggests that these collapses occurred frequently, with sudden drops in diversity followed by rebounds. Each cycle left behind survivors that were more adaptable, more versatile, better suited to endure instability. Ecosystems evolved alongside organisms, becoming more sophisticated in their resilience. These patterns remind us that ecosystems are not static creations but dynamic processes. In the Cambrian, we see the origins of the feedback loops that still govern life today. Predators limiting prey populations, prey shaping predator adaptations, decomposers recycling nutrients, and producers anchoring the entire web. Each group depended on the others, and together they formed systems greater than the sum of their parts. What makes the Cambrian Explosion so extraordinary is not simply the diversity of species, but the integration of those species into functioning networks. This was the first time life learned how to persist not only as individuals but as communities. Yet even amid resilience, contingency ruled. The survival of ecosystems often hinged on chance. A mudslide that buried a reef, a sudden depletion of oxygen, a volcanic event altering ocean chemistry. Communities rebuilt themselves not with intention, but through the persistence of those lucky or adaptable enough to endure. This interplay of structure and chance remains the hallmark of evolution. The Cambrian Explosion was not destiny. It was possibility shaped by circumstance, a pattern repeated through every extinction and recovery that followed. To imagine these ecosystems is to see seas alive with tension and balance. Picture reefs of sponge-like organisms rising from the seafloor, their surfaces crawling with trilobites and worms. Filter feeders wave feathery appendages in the current, drawing plankton from the water, while predators glide silently at the edges, waiting for movement. Scavengers pick over the remains left behind, burrowing through the sand to recycle what others abandon. Above it all, plankton drift in shimmering clouds, invisible yet essential, the silent foundation of abundance. Every corner of this world hums with interaction, each thread woven into a fabric of interdependence. The Cambrian Explosion teaches us that complexity is fragile, born of balance but always vulnerable to disruption. It reminds us that ecosystems are not only products of evolution but engines of it, driving adaptation by shaping the pressures organisms face. Without ecosystems, diversity would falter. Without diversity, ecosystems would collapse. The two are inseparable, bound in a feedback loop that began 500 million years ago and continues today. And so the Cambrian seas, alien yet familiar, reveal themselves as the first laboratories of ecology. Their lessons are written into the DNA of every organism and echoed in every ecosystem we see around us, from rainforests to coral reefs. But as we follow the story forward, we are compelled to ask, if these fragile beginnings laid the foundation, how did later ages refine and expand them? What new balances emerged as ecosystems grew more elaborate, and how did they endure the storms of extinction that were yet to come? The Cambrian Explosion is often described as the origin of animals as we know them, but it was also the beginning of something more profound, the shaping of Earth's environments by the creatures themselves. For the first time, animals did not simply adapt to their surroundings, they transformed them. The seafloors, sediments, and even the chemistry of the oceans began to bear the marks of animal activity. In this sense, the Cambrian was the dawn of what scientists call ecosystem engineering, where life modifies its own stage, setting the conditions for future change. It was a silent revolution, less visible than claws or eyes, but equally transformative. Consider the burrowers. Before the Cambrian, the seafloor was blanketed in microbial mats, thick carpets of cyanobacteria and other microbes that spread across sediments largely undisturbed. These mats created stable but relatively stagnant environments, with oxygen confined mostly to surface layers. When worms and other burrowing animals appeared, they disrupted this ancient order. By tunneling through the sediment, they broke apart microbial mats, allowed oxygen to penetrate deeper layers, and stirred nutrients back into circulation. This process, known as bioturbation, reshaped marine chemistry and opened new ecological opportunities. Creatures that once relied on mats for food had to adapt or vanish, while others exploited the enriched, oxygenated sediments to thrive. In the twisting trails of ancient burrows preserved in stone, we see the beginnings of Earth's transformation by animal labour. The introduction of skeletons and shells also changed the planet. Before the Cambrian, soft-bodied organisms dominated, leaving behind faint impressions at best. But with the rise of hard parts, the ocean floor became littered with fragments of carapaces and shells. These skeletal remains accumulated into layers of sedimentary rock, altering the geology itself. More than debris, these fragments created habitats for small creatures who found shelter in the crevices of broken shells. In time, the cycle of shell production, death, and accumulation created feedback loops that increased the stability and diversity of ecosystems. Evolution was not only producing new forms, it was rewriting the geology of the Earth. Reefs illustrate this transformation vividly. Cambrian reefs, built by sponges and early reef-forming organisms, were far smaller than later coral structures, but they represented the first deliberate shaping of the ocean's architecture by living things. Rising from the seabed, they created vertical spaces in an otherwise flat world, multiplying ecological niches. Creatures clung to their surfaces hid within their pores, or grazed in the surrounding currents. These reefs acted as havens, concentrating life and intensifying ecological interactions. The construction of reefs marked a turning point. Life had begun to build its own landscapes, not merely occupy them. Predators, too, transformed the environment in subtle ways. By preying on certain groups, they shaped the distribution of prey species, preventing any single lineage from overwhelming ecosystems. Their hunting patterns created pressure points that rippled outward, influencing where prey lived, how they behaved, and what adaptations they developed. In this sense, predators functioned like ecological sculptors, shaping the balance of communities through selective pressure. Even the scars on trilobite fossils, healed over after attacks, are evidence of predators inscribing their influence on the very bodies of their prey. These changes extended to the chemistry of the oceans. As shells and skeletons accumulated, they altered the carbon cycle, locking carbon into sediments and affecting the balance of atmospheric gases. The burial of organic material in black shales during episodes of low oxygen also impacted global chemistry, tying biology to geophysical processes in new ways. Life and Earth were no longer separate forces but deeply entwined, each reshaping the other. The Cambrian explosion thus marks the dawn of a feedback system that continues today. Biology influencing geology, geology influencing biology, an endless dialogue across time. The evidence of this transformation survives not only in body fossils but in trace fossils, marks left by movement and behaviour. Tracks, burrows and feeding trails preserved in rock tell us that animals were no longer passive inhabitants but active shapers of their world. These traces often outnumber body fossils, a reminder that behaviour can be more enduring than anatomy. They show that the Cambrian was not merely about what creatures looked like, but what they did, how they altered sediments, oxygenated sea floors and structured communities. Each trace fossil is a signature of agency, a message from creatures that may no longer exist but whose actions still ripple through time. Yet the reshaping of Earth by Cambrian life was not without cost. By disrupting microbial mats, burrowers eliminated entire ecosystems that had thrived for billions of years. What had once been stable, layered environments gave way to oxygenated sediments, more dynamic but less hospitable to certain microbial lineages. This pattern, life displacing life through environmental change, would repeat across Earth's history, from the rise of forests that altered atmospheric carbon dioxide to the industrial age of humanity. In this sense, the Cambrian explosion foreshadows a truth that would define the planet, that the greatest force of transformation on Earth is life itself. The Cambrian also teaches us that innovation is inseparable from disruption. Every new adaptation, burrowing, reef building, shell formation, reshaped not only individuals but the stage they inhabited. Innovation created winners and losers, stability and instability, abundance and extinction. Evolution was not a gentle unfolding but a process of continual remaking, where the environment itself was constantly rewritten by the very creatures struggling within it. The Cambrian explosion, then, was less a single event than the beginning of a dynamic system, where life and Earth entered into a partnership of transformation. To picture this is to imagine seas where every movement left a mark. Worms dug through the mud, leaving tunnels that aerated sediments for generations to come. Trilobites scuttled in herds, their armoured bodies shedding exoskeletons that piled into drifts of mineral fragments. Sponges rose like silent towers, shaping currents around their porous bodies. Predators lunged through schools of prey, their attacks scattering populations and rewriting the behaviours of survivors. Even in death, creatures left their shells and carapaces to become the foundation of new habitats. The Cambrian world was alive not only with bodies but with echoes, each life leaving behind traces that changed the world for others. This perspective shifts how we see the Cambrian explosion. It was not only the birth of diversity, but the birth of environmental engineering, the moment when life ceased to be merely reactive and became constructive. The oceans were transformed not just by external forces like tectonics and climate, but by the restless activity of their inhabitants. Life became a geologic agent, shaping sediments, cycles, and landscapes in ways that would reverberate across eons. Without this transformation, the later expansion of ecosystems, the rise of reefs, and the colonization of land would not have been possible. And so the Cambrian stands as a reminder that to study life is to study Earth itself, for the two have been entwined since those shallow seas first filled with burrows and shells. The creatures of this age may seem alien, but their legacy is written in every ecosystem that followed. The forests that breathe, the reefs that shelter, the soils that sustain, all carry the imprint of Cambrian innovation. And as we carry this story forward, we are left to ask, if the Cambrian was the first age when life reshaped the planet, what greater transformations awaited as ecosystems grew more elaborate, and as life began its march beyond the seas onto the solid ground of continents? The Cambrian explosion, with all its shimmering diversity, was not an isolated moment sealed in time. It was a beginning, a prelude to the even greater transformations that would follow as ecosystems grew more intricate and life pressed outward into new territories. Yet before animals ever reached the continents, the seas themselves deepened their complexity. The Ordovician period, which came after the Cambrian, is often remembered as the true flowering of marine life, but its roots lie in the Cambrian world, where the first systems of interaction and innovation were tested. To understand this continuity, one must look at the pathways opened by Cambrian evolution, pathways that set the stage for every age that followed. Among the most important of these pathways was the establishment of trophic layers, structured food webs with multiple levels of energy transfer. Before the Cambrian, food chains were relatively flat, microbial producers at the base with a few simple grazers above them. By the close of the Cambrian, food webs had expanded into towering systems, with plankton feeding filter feeders feeding grazers, grazers hunted by predators, and predators themselves falling prey to scavengers after death. Energy flowed in spirals of interaction, creating stability through complexity. These networks made ecosystems more resilient, capable of absorbing shocks and reorganizing after disturbance. It was the invention of hierarchy within ecology, a principle that still governs every modern ecosystem. Another legacy was the diversification of body plans into functional guilds. Some creatures became specialized burrowers, turning the seafloor into a dynamic layer of tunnels and oxygenated sediments. Others became filter feeders, shaping the chemistry of water by removing plankton and redistributing energy. Still others became apex predators, refining speed, vision, and grasping appendages. Each guild represented not just an individual innovation, but a contribution to the overall system, weaving roles into interdependence. This organization of life into functional groups laid the foundation for ecological niches, a concept that defines how organisms interact with both environment and one another. The Cambrian, in essence, invented roles, and those roles became the scaffolding of future ecosystems. The Cambrian also saw the first hints of geographic distribution shaping evolution. Fossil beds from China, Canada, Australia, and Greenland reveal ecosystems with both shared and unique creatures. Some groups, like trilobites, spread widely across oceans, while others remained localized, evolving in isolation. This pattern of global distribution and local adaptation would become a dominant force in later periods, driving biodiversity through separation and reconnection. The shifting of continents and currents scattered populations, creating opportunities for divergence. Even in its earlier stages, evolution was learning to use geography as an engine of novelty. Climate played an equally profound role. The Cambrian was not a uniform age of warmth, but a period marked by fluctuations. Episodes of glaciation gave way to intervals of warmth, and sea levels rose and fell in response. These changes repeatedly restructured habitats, forcing organisms to adapt or vanish. Shallow seas expanded and contracted, alternately offering nurseries for diversity and extinguishing them in sudden retreat. This cycle of expansion and collapse mirrored the rhythms that would define life's long history. Stability shattered by change, followed by renewal. The Cambrian explosion was therefore not a single burst but a pattern of pulses, driven in part by the climate's restlessness. At the genetic level, the innovations of the Cambrian did not vanish when the sea shifted. They persisted, becoming the inherited toolkit of future ages. Hox genes, already orchestrating the architecture of trilobites and chordates, remained the foundation for vertebrates, insects, mollusks, and more. Every subsequent leap in evolution, from the rise of fish to the appearance of wings, built upon this genetic scaffolding first tested in the Cambrian. In this sense, the explosion never truly ended. It continues in us, in every vertebrate spine and every arthropod limb. The Cambrian was the unlocking of possibility, and its echo resonates through the genetic code of all animals. But the Cambrian's importance lies not only in what survived, it lies also in what was lost. Countless lineages disappeared, their body plans leaving no descendants. The record of these vanished experiments is a reminder that evolution is not a ladder, but a branching tree, where most branches end in silence. Their extinction pruned the possibilities, narrowing the field to a smaller set of body plans that would dominate the future. The modern phyla, the great groups of animals, are survivors of this winnowing process. To walk through the Cambrian seas in imagination is to see a riot of forms, but to step forward in time is to see only a few of those forms endure. These survivors became the architects of all later diversity. The Cambrian also demonstrated the interplay between chance and necessity. Chance determined which lineages endured the environmental fluctuations, the sudden mudslides, the oxygen crashes. Necessity shaped the forms that survived, forcing them into arms races of adaptation. This dance of randomness and pressure is still at the heart of evolution today. The Cambrian explosion dramatizes it on a scale that remains startling. A world filled with possibilities, most extinguished, a few enduring, their survival contingent as much on luck as on innovation. It is a humbling reminder that our own existence is not the product of inevitability but of chance filtered through deep time. To visualize these seas at their close is to imagine ecosystems already foreshadowing what would come. Reefs rose in scattered patches, sheltering filter feeders and grazers. Trilobites, armoured and watchful, moved in coordinated groups across sandy plains. Worms dug elaborate burrows beneath them, while predators patrolled the water above, their compound eyes shimmering like facets of crystal. The seabed was a shifting mosaic, alive with interaction, alive with memory. Each creature bore the history of its ancestors' experiments, and each contributed to the shaping of Earth's future. The Cambrian was no longer only about survival, it was about inheritance, the passage of possibility into the hands of the next ages. The true measure of the Cambrian explosion is not simply in the diversity of its creatures, but in the systems it birthed. Hierarchical food webs, functional guilds, geographic differentiation, climate-driven pulses, genetic toolkits, and the winnowing of extinction. Together, these systems transformed Earth from a microbial world into an animal world, a place where life became inseparable from ecology, geology, and time itself. And yet, the Cambrian remains filled with mysteries. Why did some body plans vanish while others endured? Why did certain lineages spread globally while others remained confined? How exactly did climate, oxygen, and tectonics interact to trigger pulses of diversification? These questions remain open, carried forward as challenges for scientists to unravel. But perhaps that is part of the Cambrian's allure, that it is less a closed chapter than a doorway into inquiry, an ancient puzzle whose pieces are still being fitted together. As we step beyond the Cambrian into the Ordovician seas, where reefs expanded and biodiversity multiplied, we carry with us the lessons of this extraordinary age. Life had discovered complexity, resilience, and interdependence. The oceans had become theatres of possibility, where extinction and innovation walked side by side. The Cambrian explosion was not an end, but an overture, and its echoes still shape the symphony of life today. The question that rises, carried on the tides of deep time, is this. Having invented complexity in the seas, how would life take its next great leap, to spread beyond water, to transform continents, and to remake Earth in even grander designs? The Cambrian explosion was not merely a biological upheaval, but also a cosmic echo of Earth's restless geology. The creatures that filled those shallow seas did not emerge in a vacuum. They were born into a world constantly shifting beneath their bodies. Tectonic plates drifted, mountains rose, oceans expanded, and climates swung between extremes. The deep time stage on which life experimented was itself unstable, and that instability may have been one of the sparks that ignited the burst of diversity. To understand the Cambrian, then, is to understand not just animals but the planet itself. its shifting continents, its volcanic pulses, its breathing oceans of carbon and oxygen. At the dawn of the Cambrian, the supercontinent Rodinia had already fractured, giving way to smaller continental blocks scattered across the globe. Vast shallow seas flooded continental margins, providing warm sunlit waters ideal for life. These continental shelves, broad and nutrient-rich, became the nurseries of Cambrian ecosystems. Here, plankton bloomed, grazers flourished, and predators prowled. The geography of the world itself created opportunity. Shallow seas offered stability for photosynthetic producers, while also concentrating life into ecosystems where interactions could multiply. Without these continental shelves, the explosion of life might have been stifled, confined to isolated pockets instead of spreading across the globe. Volcanic activity further shaped these conditions. Eruptions released minerals and nutrients into the seas, fueling algal blooms that in turn fed filter feeders and grazers. But volcanic gases also carried risk, periodically lowering oxygen levels and stressing ecosystems. The duality of volcanism, both destructive and nourishing, mirrored the evolutionary pattern of the Cambrian itself, where every opportunity carried danger, and every collapse carried the seeds of renewal. Geology, like biology, operated in rhythms of boom and bust, and life was forced to adapt to the cadence. Oxygen played perhaps the most decisive role. The Cambrian was a time when oxygen levels in the atmosphere and oceans rose significantly compared to earlier ages. This rise allowed animals to grow larger, to develop more complex metabolisms, and to fuel active lifestyles like predation and swimming. Oxygen was the invisible foundation of the Cambrian Explosion, an unseen force coursing through the seas, empowering eyes to scan, muscles to contract, and nervous systems to fire. Yet oxygen levels did not remain steady. Fluctuations created stress, thinning populations in deeper waters while rewarding those able to exploit oxygen-rich shallows. In these shifting gradients, evolution sharpened its tools, testing resilience in the crucible of chemistry. Carbon cycles, too, bore the fingerprints of Cambrian life. As shelled creatures proliferated, they locked carbon into their exoskeletons, which upon death settled into sediments. This process drew carbon from the atmosphere and sequestered it in stone, subtly cooling the planet over time. It was the first large-scale biological engineering of Earth's climate, the beginning of a feedback loop that still governs the planet today. Life was not only shaped by its environment, it was already reshaping the environment in return. Each shell, each skeleton, was a geological act as much as a biological one. The Cambrian seas were also restless with climate shifts. Fossil evidence and isotopic studies suggest that glaciations may have brushed the edges of this age, cooling seas and altering circulation patterns. These cold intervals pruned ecosystems, stressing those unable to adapt to reduce productivity, but also setting the stage for rebounds of diversity when warmth returned. Climate swings created cycles of collapse and recovery, rhythms that reinforced the pace of evolutionary innovation. Every contraction was followed by expansion, every silence by a chorus of new forms. Tectonics influenced more than geography. It also influenced ocean chemistry. As continents shifted, rivers carried minerals into the seas, enriching waters with phosphates, sulfates, and other nutrients. These pulses may have fueled the blooms of algae and plankton that underpinned food webs. But mineral influx could also create toxic conditions when excessive, causing local extinctions. The interplay of land and sea created unpredictable feedbacks, teaching life to endure not only biological pressures, but geochemical volatility. The Cambrian explosion in this sense was as much a geological drama as a biological one, with tectonic forces directing the tempo of life's experiments. The rocks of this age bear silent testimony. Black shales speak of oxygen-starved waters where life suffocated in darkness. Limestone layers record reefs built by sponges and early reef builders, rising in the light of shallow shelves. Sandstones preserve ripple marks where trilobites once marched in lines, their tracks etched into the seabed. These rocks are more than archives. They are the memory of a planet in transformation, the canvas on which life painted its first intricate designs. Every fossil is framed within geology, every creature inseparable from the stage that bore it. To imagine the Cambrian in its full context is to see not only seas filled with creatures, but continents drifting like rafts, volcanoes erupting in fiery plumes, and climates swaying between warmth and chill. Picture trilobites scuttling across a seabed only to be buried by a sudden mudslide, their forms preserved for 500 million years. Imagine reefs rising along continental shelves only to crumble when sea levels dropped. Picture predators flourishing in oxygen-rich shallows while deeper waters turned anoxic, barren of life. The drama of biology was written against a backdrop of geology, and the two were inseparable. Perhaps the most striking lesson of this era is that life does not evolve in isolation. The Cambrian explosion was triggered not only by genetic and ecological factors, but also by planetary forces: oxygen, carbon, tectonics, volcanism, and climate. Biology and geology are threads of the same tapestry, woven together so tightly that one cannot be pulled without unravelling the other. To study the Cambrian is to study Earth as a whole, a system where life and planet co-create each other in cycles of invention and collapse. This perspective invites reflection on our own time. Just as Cambrian animals altered their world through shells, burrows, and reefs, humanity today alters the Earth through industry, agriculture, and climate change. The scale is different, but the principle is the same: life reshaping Earth, Earth reshaping life. The Cambrian teaches us that such transformations are not unusual. They are the rule of the planet. What matters is how those transformations are absorbed, how resilience is built or broken in the face of change. And so, as we follow the story forward, the Cambrian stands not as an isolated explosion, but as the first great conversation between life and planet. Its creatures were both products and agents of geology, both fragile inhabitants and powerful shapers of Earth. Their legacy lies not only in their bodies, but in the cycles they initiated: oxygen drawn, carbon buried, sediments stirred, climates shifted. In their restless activity, we see the origins of a truth that defines our world: that life and Earth are one system, bound in an endless dance of change. As we step into the next act of this story, into the Ordovician seas where reefs will expand and biodiversity will climb to new heights, we carry with us this understanding: that the Cambrian was not merely about creatures inventing themselves, but about a planet inventing with them. And the question that rises from this realization is profound. If life and Earth are partners in transformation, what futures do they write together? And how far will this partnership carry them through the storms of deep time? The Cambrian explosion is often remembered as a moment of origin, but its deepest meaning may lie in how it foreshadowed the cycles of creation and destruction that would govern all of life's history. What began in those seas, the rise of predators, the weaving of ecosystems, the shaping of environments, was only the first act in a much longer drama. As the Cambrian drew toward its close, life was already entering into a rhythm of expansion and collapse, of bursts of innovation followed by pruning extinctions. It was a rhythm that would echo in the great mass extinctions to come, from the Ordovician to the Permian and beyond, each reshaping the path of evolution. The Cambrian was not only the dawn of diversity, it was the dawn of impermanence, where extinction became a partner in the making of the living world. Fossil evidence shows that the Cambrian was punctuated by episodes of decline, periods when diversity contracted sharply. These smaller-scale extinctions, often triggered by fluctuations in oxygen or shifts in sea level, pruned the tree of life even as it grew. Entire lineages vanished, leaving behind no descendants. Some of these losses may have been abrupt, the result of sudden environmental crashes, while others were gradual, driven by competition, or the failure to adapt to new ecological pressures. The Cambrian explosion was therefore not a steady upward climb, but a jagged pattern, where loss was as common as gain. Each extinction was both an ending and an opening, clearing space for survivors to radiate into newly vacant niches. The most significant of these crises was the Cambrian extinction, a relatively little-known event compared to later cataclysms, but nonetheless pivotal. During this period, trilobites, the iconic survivors of the Cambrian, suffered massive losses, with many families disappearing altogether. Black shale deposits suggest that widespread anoxia, the depletion of oxygen in deeper waters, played a central role. When oxygen vanished, ecosystems collapsed, and creatures adapted to shallow or oxygen-rich waters survived while those in deeper habitats perished. This selective filter altered the composition of life, favouring lineages capable of enduring stress. The extinction was not total, but its pruning effect reshaped marine ecosystems, setting the stage for the Ordovician diversification that would soon follow. These cycles remind us that extinction is not merely destructive but also generative. By removing competitors, extinctions free resources and habitats for others. By narrowing diversity, they channel evolution into new directions. The survivors carry forward traits that allowed them to endure, embedding resilience into the fabric of life. The Cambrian, then, was the beginning of this dance between creation and destruction, a pattern that would govern the unfolding of evolution across the next 500 million years. This perspective shifts how we see the Cambrian explosion. It was not a singular miracle, but a dynamic interplay between invention and erasure, between flourishing and collapse. Its legacy lies not only in the body plans that survived, but in the cycles of renewal it established. The Cambrian showed that life is not static, that resilience is born from impermanence, and that survival depends not on permanence, but on adaptability. These lessons remain as relevant now as they were 500 million years ago. The fragility of Cambrian ecosystems is also evident in the fossil record. Communities preserved in sites like the Burgess Shale often include species that exist nowhere else, suggesting that ecosystems were localized and vulnerable to disruption. A single mudslide could entomb an entire community, erasing its unique forms in an instant. Yet other regions, like Xinjiang in China, reveal similar ecosystems flourishing independently, evidence of resilience through geographic spread. Diversity was not uniform, but patchwork, scattered across shallow seas, each patch vulnerable yet collectively robust. This mosaic structure was another inheritance of the Cambrian, a template for how biodiversity could persist even when local communities collapsed. The Cambrian also established the precedent of escalation. Once predators arose, prey responded with armour, spines and burrowing. Once burrowers disrupted sediments, microbial mats declined, giving way to oxygen-rich seafloors. Each adaptation altered the environment, triggering new pressures that demanded further change. This feedback loop ensured that life would never again return to stasis. Escalation became the engine of evolution, driving arms races that shaped ecosystems for millions of years. The Cambrian did not invent change, but it invented acceleration, embedding dynamism into the structure of life itself. To visualize the end of the Cambrian is to see a world still restless with invention but shadowed by instability. Trilobite herds move across the seabed, but their numbers falter, thinned by oxygen stress. Predators glide above, their compound eyes still sharp, yet their dominance uncertain in waters that fluctuate between abundance and scarcity. Reefs rise in scattered patches, only to crumble when sea levels shift. Burrowers continue their silent work, oxygenating sediments, even as storms and anoxic pulses erase their communities. It is a world both vibrant and precarious, alive with possibility but marked by fragility. This fragility carries lessons that resonate across deep time. Every major extinction that followed, the Ordovician, the Devonian, the Permian, was an amplification of patterns first rehearsed in the Cambrian. Environmental instability, ecological escalation, and geographic patchiness combined to create vulnerability. Yet each extinction was followed by renewal, often greater than what came before. The Cambrian taught life how to endure through collapse, how to rebuild from fragments, how to weave resilience out of impermanence. Without these lessons, the history of life might have ended in silence long before reaching us. The philosophical weight of the Cambrian lies in its duality. It shows us a world filled with abundance yet governed by loss, a world where creation and destruction are inseparable. It forces us to confront the contingency of our own existence, for had different lineages survived, the story of Earth would look utterly different. The creatures that endured, primitive chordates, arthropods, mollusks, were not inevitable victors but survivors of chance and circumstance. Their endurance carried forward the genes that shape our own bodies, but their survival was not destiny. It was accident, filtered through resilience. The Cambrian Explosion thus stands as both celebration and elegy. It is the celebration of life's first great flowering, but also the elegy of countless lineages that vanished without a trace. It teaches us that to marvel at diversity is also to recognize the silence of extinction, that the richness of life is built upon layers of loss. In this sense, the Cambrian is not only a scientific puzzle, but a meditation on existence itself, a reminder that survival is fragile, that every lineage, including our own, balances on the edge of impermanence. As the Cambrian gave way to the Ordovician, the stage was set for even greater expansion, a diversification that would fill oceans with coral reefs, fish, and ecosystems of staggering complexity. Yet the shadow of extinction never left. It was woven into the story from the beginning, and so the question that drifts forward through deep time is not simply what life created, but what it lost, and how in that loss new worlds were made possible. The Cambrian Explosion, that great surge of life 500 million years ago, now stands in our imagination as both a window into origins and a mirror reflecting our own precarious moment on Earth. It was the first time the planet teemed with diverse, complex animals, the first time ecosystems formed intricate webs of interdependence, the first time life reshaped its environment on a grand scale. But it was also the first rehearsal of impermanence, where extinctions pruned as much as they created, and where resilience was forged in the constant interplay of survival and loss. To conclude the story of the Cambrian is to recognise that its lessons reach far beyond paleontology. They echo into philosophy, ecology, and even the questions of humanity's place in the unfolding drama of life. One of the deepest legacies of the Cambrian is the principle that innovation and extinction are inseparable. Life did not ascend smoothly, nor did it perfect itself in linear fashion. Instead, it tested endlessly, spines that dazzled, eyes that pierced, limbs that grasped. Some of these designs thrived, forming the blueprints of modern animals. Others vanished, leaving behind fossils that seem more like alien art than ancestors. Evolution is revealed not as progress but as improvisation, a constant trial and error performance with failure as frequent as success. This recognition humbles us, reminding us that our own bodies, our spines, muscles, senses, are the improbable survivors of 500 million years of experimentation. Equally important is the Cambrian lesson about interdependence. Before this age, life was largely solitary, microbial mats spreading across seafloors, colonies persisting in quiet obscurity. But in the Cambrian, ecosystems emerged, predators hunting prey, scavengers recycling remains, reef builders creating habitats for others. Life became inseparable from community. Each species carried not only its own fate but the fate of many others. This principle still governs the biosphere today. From rainforest to coral reefs, no organism stands alone. The Cambrian was the first rehearsal of ecological truth, that survival is not an individual achievement but a collective one, written into the weaving of food webs and the rhythms of cycles. The Cambrian also shows us that resilience lies not in avoiding change but in adapting to it. Oxygen levels fluctuated, climates swung between extremes, tectonic forces reshaped continents and seas. In these shifting conditions, life persisted not by resisting disruption, but by absorbing it, by finding new ways to inhabit a transformed world. This resilience is perhaps the most enduring gift of the Cambrian, the recognition that survival depends less on permanence than on flexibility, less on control than on response. It is a lesson that reverberates with urgency today, as humanity faces ecological instability of its own making. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Cambrian is its reminder of contingency. The creatures that endured were not destined to survive. They were the lucky, the adaptable, the ones whose designs happened to match the shifting stage of Earth. Had oxygen fallen differently, had tectonics shifted otherwise, had extinction struck with a slightly altered hand, the lineages that led to vertebrates, and ultimately to us, might never have persisted. The world could have belonged to entirely different descendants, their body plans unimaginable to us. The Cambrian whispers to us that our existence is not inevitable, but precarious, a product of chance woven into necessity. To grasp this is to recognize the fragility of our place in time. And yet the Cambrian is not only a story of fragility, but of promise. In its burst of creativity, life demonstrated its boundless capacity for novelty. Eyes, skeletons, nervous systems, complex behaviors, all appeared within a geological instant, and many have endured across 500 million years. The potential encoded in the simplest cells blossomed into forms of startling complexity. This flowering tells us that life, given space and energy, will always invent, always adapt, always surprise. The Cambrian explosion is not only about what was, but about what life can be. To envision the Cambrian is to see seas shimmering with alien yet familiar motion. Trilobites march across rippled sands, their compound eyes glinting in dim light. Worms tunnel beneath, oxygenating the sediments. Predators glide, compound eyes tracking the faintest flicker. Reefs rise in miniature towers filled with grazers and filter feeders. Clouds of larvae drift above, seeds of continuity carried by currents, and in every corner lies both vitality and silence, the abundance of the present and the inevitability of extinction. It is a world alive with contradiction, a world that mirrors our own in ways both uncanny and instructive. For us, the Cambrian offers more than scientific wonder. It offers perspective. It reminds us that the story of life is not linear progress, but resilience through upheaval. It reminds us that ecosystems are fragile webs, strengthened by diversity yet vulnerable to imbalance. It reminds us that extinction is as natural as survival, but that what endures can shape the future for millions of years. Above all, it reminds us that our existence rests on the survival of fragile ancestors who navigated crises we cannot fully imagine. To carry that knowledge is to carry humility. As we reflect on this ancient explosion, we might ask, what does it mean for humanity to stand in the lineage of such improbable survivors? What responsibility does it place upon us, the one species capable of understanding not only its own history, but the history of life itself? The Cambrian explosion teaches us that life will adapt, but it does not guarantee that every lineage will. Survival belongs not to the strongest or the most intelligent, but to the adaptable. In an age of climate change and ecological disruption, this truth confronts us with stark clarity. The Cambrian is not distant prehistory. It is a mirror of our present challenges. And so, the Cambrian explosion ends not in silence, but in resonance. Its creatures, long turned to stone, still speak. Their fossils whisper of invention and impermanence, of ecosystems fragile yet resilient, of extinction as sculptor, and chance as companion. They remind us that we are children of deep time, heirs to 500 million years of experimentation. To honour that inheritance is to listen, to learn, to act with the awareness that our fate is bound to the same rhythms that shaped trilobites, worms, and Anomalocaris. The story of the Cambrian is not finished. It continues in every ecosystem alive today, in every creature that perceives, adapts, and interacts. It continues in us, in the genes that trace back to those ancient seas. It continues in the questions we ask and the choices we make. The Cambrian was the first explosion of possibility, and we live still in its reverberations. The final lesson it leaves us is not of the past, but of the future. That life, once awakened, will always find ways to endure, to create, to dream in forms beyond imagination. And so, as the curtain falls on this chapter of deep time, we are left with a question that carries forward across eons. What explosions of possibility still lie ahead, waiting in the hidden potentials of life and planet? And what new worlds will they one day bring to light?